steel, firearms, and the Industrialists crossing into another world. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 476 Loyalty 3. Your Highness, MacDonald looked at Prince Antonio, hesitant to speak. Johnny had been rescued from the Diaz family. Whether MacDonald himself was responsible or not, it meant that MacDonald had completely broken with the Diaz family. Originally, the Diaz family had gained MacDonald's temporary allegiance because of Johnny's hostage, but now that the hostage had been rescued, the temporary allegiance had immediately turned into hatred, and the rift between the two sides could not be mended no matter what. Your Excellency, Antonio understood the meaning in MacDonald's eyes. Or rather, MacDonald's thoughts were exactly what he hoped for. If you are at ease, I don't have much experience taking care of children, but at least his personal safety can be guaranteed. If you are at ease, you can let this child stay with me, and I will place this child under my protection. MacDonald breathed a sigh of relief, a heavy weight lifted from his heart. Your Highness, this is precisely what I wanted to ask of you. However, I have already troubled you to rescue Johnny, and now I need you to provide him with shelter. I am truly indebted to you, haha. Antonio waved his hand. What are you saying? Have you forgotten that this child is also a descendant of the Griffin family? He shares my blood, and in terms of seniority, he should call me uncle. In every respect, my obligations to him are far greater than yours. MacDonald felt a surge of warmth in his heart. Although he knew that for a prince seeking supreme power in the Empire, these words were likely just a pretense to win him over, it had undeniably been effective. He said, Your Highness, I thank you for your kindness. I swear, Johnny will never pose a threat to you. He and his descendants will live as ordinary people of the Empire for generations to come, under your and your descendants' rule. The old marshal's last sentence was clearly loaded with meaning. Prince Antonio smiled, knowing that MacDonald had sided with him, or at least wouldn't stand in his way. No, don't you think it's too cruel to Johnny? Just because of a mistake by his ancestors, which, strictly speaking, wasn't a mistake, he can't enjoy the glory his bloodline deserves. That's unfair. What do you mean, Marshal MacDonald? I assure you, if at some point in the future I have enough power, I will restore Johnny's status as a member of the royal family, restore his rightful glory and treatment. At this moment, MacDonald finally made up his mind. He would do everything in his power to assist the prince before him. The guard knelt motionless before his master's seat, quietly awaiting his question. The guard's master was an elderly man with white hair and beard, about 60 years old. His beard was meticulously trimmed, hanging naturally down to his chest. He wore a long silk robe, exuding an air of refined elegance. He was Duke Yash, the Chancellor of the Gabella Empire, and also the current Emperor's father-in-law and the eldest prince's maternal grandfather. So, the Duke, who had been sitting quietly in his seat as if resting with his eyes closed, finally spoke. The Somalit family is all gone. Yes, sir. When we went to check today, we didn't find a single survivor. They were all ashes of corpses. It was impossible to tell who was who. The old man's face remained impassive. The child can't be found either. Yes, he may have perished in the fire. Do you think this fire was an accident? No, sir. I believe it was most likely deliberately set. The old man half opened his eyes. Why? The guard thought for a moment and replied, First, the Somalit family's mansion is right in the center of the affected area. Second, according to the night patrol guards of River Sand, when the fire started, a pillar of fire shot straight into the sky and then scattered. We don't know how that was done, but this scene doesn't seem like an accidental fire at all. The old man's hands clenched tightly. The Imperial Chancellor, Duke Yash, was pondering a huge question. What about the child? If the child had perished in the fire, then MacDonald would certainly unleash all his anger on the first prince and the Diaz family. If the child had been rescued, then the Diaz family would lose its control over MacDonald, and would still bear some of MacDonald's wrath. In any case, MacDonald would definitely break with the Diaz family and the first prince. The situation had reached a thorny point. Duke Diosh pondered silently. Was there a mole on his side? Or had MacDonald and Antonio been in cahoots all along, and MacDonald had sought Antonio's help after being blackmailed by him, but did he disregard a child's life in doing so? A sound of footsteps interrupted Duke Diosh's thoughts. The guard who had previously reported to him bowed to the newcomer. "Your Highness, good day." The eldest prince of the Gabella Empire, Felix, looked anxiously at his grandfather. "Grandfather, I heard something happened in River Sand Town." Duke Diosh frowned. His grandson, of such high status, was always so impulsive. How could he shoulder the heavy responsibility of ruling a nation like this? He gestured for the guard to explain the situation to Felix. The guard reluctantly recounted the situation in River Sand Town to the eldest prince. "Useless. All useless. Can't even keep an eye on one person." The prince vented his anger on the guard before him, stomping on his face. The guard liked the blood from his lips, remaining silent. Felix immediately concluded that the fire was arson. This was provocation. This was a serious provocation. That Antonio had actually slapped him in the face with such arrogant means. "Felix, you're too impatient." Duke Diosh couldn't stand it any longer and reprimanded him. "But, grandfather," Felix waved his arms, "what if that old man MacDonald sides with Antonio? That would greatly enhance his military power." Duke Diosh said sternly, "Felix, if you truly intend to inherit this empire, you should cultivate the ability to remain unfazed even if mountains crumble before your eyes. MacDonald is indeed a powerful force, but not powerful enough to destroy us. Otherwise, this country would already belong to the MacDonald family." "What are you and Antonio arguing about?" Felix blushed deeply at Duke Diosh's words. "Grandfather, I was wrong. But what should we do now?" Duke Diosh opened his eyes wide, his gaze sharp. "Since we've come this far, some plans must be moved forward. Please vote. Please recommend." Chapter 477 Gerd Rodney 1. Father in heaven, Hansel rubbed his eyes and looked at the letter in his hand again. This letter, more specifically, was a decree written by His Majesty the King himself. His Majesty the King. His Majesty the Supreme King actually wrote to me personally. After experiencing a series of emotional shifts, shock, disbelief, and repeated confirmation, Hansel was overjoyed. Half an hour earlier, Hansel, as the head of the Ministry of Agriculture, had just returned to his residence from the State Council when his servant told him that 3 important figures from the capital, Jingaeo, were waiting for him in the reception room. Since they were from Jingaeo, Hansel dared not be negligent and quickly washed his face before going to see his guests. Upon entering the reception room, he saw 3 distinguished young men sitting there. The one sitting in the middle was slightly older, with a thin face, deep-set eyes, a meticulously trimmed mustache, and a steady gaze. The 2 men beside him were much younger, not much older than Earl Gleman. They looked remarkably alike, clearly twins. Although their faces were round and fair-skinned, they bore a resemblance to the man before them, perhaps his twin brothers. "I am Baron Hansel Abbott, the royal representative in the Northwest Bay, and the director of the Agriculture Department of the Council of Arda, Bayhorn, and Emden. May I ask who you 3 are?" Facing the guests from Jingaeo, Hansel dared not be presumptuous and politely inquired about their identities, though he couldn't help but repeat his titles. The older young man in the middle slowly stood up, smiling, and said, "Baron Abbott, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm also pleased to see you in such good health. My name is Gerd Rodney, perhaps you've heard of me." "Rodney? The royal family?" Hansel was startled. "Wait, Gerd Rodney? Wasn't he the eldest son of His Majesty the King's brother, Prince Jason Rodney?" Hansel's mind raced. Duke Gerd had twin brothers, August Rodney and Ulrico Rodney. Were these the 2 beside him? Hansel's face instantly adopted a solemn expression. "3 distinguished gentlemen, please forgive my lack of hospitality. Your Excellency, please sit down." Ulrico Rodney smiled and sat down again, while Hansel instructed a servant to brew tea with the finest tea leaves in the house. "This is my brother, August Rodney," Gerd said, gesturing to his brother on the left. August Rodney had a gentle demeanor. Upon hearing his brother's introduction, he immediately stood up, giving Hansel a slightly shy smile and even gesturing a greeting. He gave the impression of being an easygoing, humble, and shy person in daily life. "This is my other brother, Ulrico Rodney," Gerd said, gesturing to his brother on the right. Unlike his twin brothers, Ulrico Rodney was extremely arrogant, merely nodding slightly to Hansel while remaining motionless on the sofa. Hansel bowed to them one by one. He asked, I wonder what important business brings the three of you to the Northwest Bay, and is there anything I can do for you? I have business to attend to here, and my two brothers have come with me to broaden their horizons, Gerd said, pulling out a letter and handing it to Hansel. The purpose of my trip is all in this letter. Looking at the signature on the envelope, Hansel's heart churned with turmoil. With slightly trembling hands, he carefully opened the envelope. He read it word by word. I have ordered Count Gerd, as the plenipotentiary representative of the royal family, to go to the Northwest Bay to discuss with Count Paul Gleman, Duke Henry Ferdinand, and other nobles of the Northwest Bay the matters concerning the introduction of secondary industries into the royal territory. As the royal family's representative in the Northwest Bay, you must assist Count Gerd in accomplishing this. And then came the scene at the beginning. Aside from personal connections with his family and friends, Hansel's only channel of communication with the Crystal Kingdom government was through the unpleasant Viscount Aiden in the kingdom's intelligence department. And this man seemed to have forgotten about him, having not sent a single message in 6 months. Hansel was left wondering whether he was a royal representative concurrently serving as the head of Arda Agriculture, or vice versa. How could the king suddenly write to him personally? He was truly flattered. Hansel reread the letter 3 times, still savoring its contents. Watching him, Eureka Rodney scoffed and whispered to his brother, he's just a low-born prostitute's son after all. He put on a show at first, but now that he's seen His Majesty's letter, he's showing his true colors. Gerd rolled his eyes at his brother, signaling him to shut up. Hansel struggled to calm his excitement and began discussing business with the 3 guests. So, His Majesty the King intends to develop industry and commerce in the royal domains. Yes, Gerd shrugged. Baron Abbot, you must know that Crystal Radiance has gathered a large number of southern nobles who have lost their lands. Right, southern nobles? I see. Hansel knew about these people from a letter from home, and he also knew they were a headache for the kingdom's government. To be honest, His Majesty the King is worried that these nobles, with nothing to do all day, might cause trouble, so he wants to give them something to do. I understand. Hansel appeared thoughtful. Gerd continued, after much thought, we could try getting these people involved in industry and commerce, especially manufacturing. If they can achieve some success, it could contribute to the kingdom's economic prosperity. Hansel replied, Your Majesty is truly far-sighted. Gerd asked somewhat uncertainly, Oh, Baron Abbot, do you think it's feasible? Feasible. Absolutely feasible. Industry and commerce accumulate wealth much faster than simply collecting taxes and rents from a few plots of farmland. In fact, I've already written several proposals to Baron Aiden. What, didn't he show them to you? Gerd was somewhat certain that his little cousin, Eileen, had said this. That Viscount Aiden was truly a fool who stifled free speech. However, he still asked with some unease, from what I understand, the Northwest Bay has already taken the lead. Won't our development in the South face strong competition? Hansel waved his hand. Your Excellency can rest assured. Given the current situation, developing industry and commerce is absolutely a surefire way to make money, as long as it's combined with a few other measures. A few other measures? Gerd smiled wryly to himself. Could it be what Eileen mentioned? If you enjoy this, don't forget to vote. Chapter 478 Gerd Rodney 2. While in Crystal Radiance, Gerd had heard Eileen describe the measures that should accompany the development of industry and commerce. However, much of what she said wasn't suitable for the royal domain. In fact, Gerd said, His Majesty the King doesn't intend to launch a large-scale operation right away. Instead, he's selectively choosing a few technologies to import and building 1 or 2 factories to see the effects. This is a prudent decision. After all, the situations in different regions are different. Hansel nodded in agreement. Truly a far-sighted king. Then, Sir Abbot, Gerd asked, which technologies and what kind of factories can we use to quickly generate profits? Porcelain, of course, Hansel blurted out without hesitation. Porcelain is practically robbery. Even after layers of tariffs, it's still Arden's most profitable product. Gerd nodded. Oh, that's true. He had witnessed a noble's frenzy for porcelain in Crystal Radiance. Now, anyone who didn't display 1 or 2 pieces of porcelain in their home was embarrassed to call themselves a noble. Hansel pondered for a moment and said, however, the technology for firing porcelain shouldn't be easy to acquire. Why? Gerd was slightly puzzled at first, then immediately realized, that's right, no one would want to share such a profitable technology with others. So, even with this so-called patent law, Count Gleman still keeps the porcelain firing technology a secret. Yes, Hansel nodded in reply. Even with a patent law, not all technologies are open to the public, such as porcelain and firearms. Gerd asked, firearms? You mean the legendary fire crossbows and thunderhammers? Are they really that powerful? Hansel confirmed, they are one of the important reasons why Count Gleman's military strength is able to subdue the major lords of the Northwest Bay, including Duke Ferdinand. Yuriko Rodney, standing to the side, raised his eyebrows. As His Majesty's subject, Gleman should offer these advanced technologies to the kingdom free of charge, whether it's porcelain or firearms. Hearing his brother's words, Gerd frowned, but still asked, if we make such a request, would Count Gleman agree? Hansel didn't answer. The lords of the kingdom's border territories have always had the obligation to send troops to fight alongside the kingdom. This was a rule established at the founding of Waldo, a reward for lords who ventured into desolate lands and expanded their territories. This rule has never changed. Although the Northwest Bay has been developed over the years and is no longer a desolate place, it is still a border region of the kingdom. Outrageous. This is disloyalty, Yuriko Rodney shouted, taking Hansel's hesitation as Gleman's attitude, since he was also Gleman's appointed head of the Ministry of Agriculture. Shut up, Yuriko, Gerd scolded his brother. Loyalty doesn't mean one-sided sacrifice. If Gleman proves his loyalty in this way, will the royal family reward him commensurate with that loyalty? The current royal family can't even settle the southern nobles who lost their lands because of their loyalty. Seeing Gerd's performance, Hansel felt a mix of emotions. Was the royal family really so weak? He sighed inwardly. His earlier offer of porcelain and firearms, followed by silence, was a test. As a member of the Technical Review Committee, he knew which technologies could be given and which couldn't. He had always believed the kingdom of Alder was powerful and glorious, with a strong king over his vassals. Even the temporary rebellions of Giles and Veblen were merely minor ailments, like a tickle. The kingdom was simply facing temporary difficulties. Once it recovered, these rebellions could be easily quelled. But what he had seen and heard in the past 2 years had begun to cast doubt on him. Giles and Veblen were still alive and kicking, even driving out the loyal lords from the occupied territories. The kingdom had only signed a somewhat respectable agreement with them before ceasing hostilities. The king couldn't even appease his loyal subjects who had lost their lands, and had to travel all the way to the Northwest Bay, a place once considered insignificant by the Crystal Radiance nobles, to seek a solution. Faced with the newly rising Paul Gleman of the Northwest Bay, Count Gerd Rodney, one of the heirs to the throne, didn't directly demand what he wanted, but instead planned to approach him with a negotiating approach. If it were during the reigns of previous kings, when the monarchy was at its peak, things would be much easier. A single command from the king could make his vassals obediently hand over anything he desired, and if the king was pleased, he might even compensate them with a large sum of wealth, such as a large territory. But now the royal family had few bargaining chips left to make vassals willingly offer anything, both in terms of military force for deterrence and wealth for rewards. However, Count Gleman's status among the many nobles of Alder had indeed risen considerably. Hansel thought to himself, I have ordered Earl Gerd, as the plenipotentiary representative of the royal family, to travel to the Northwest Bay to discuss matters concerning the introduction of secondary industries into the royal territory with Earl Paul Gleman, Duke Henry Ferdinand, and other lords of the Northwest Bay. In this letter, the king first emphasized Earl Gleman, then politely mentioned Duke Ferdinand, categorizing the other lords as others. Gerd did not intend to continue discussing how Gleman would demonstrate his loyalty. He asked, besides the technologies that Earl Gleman intends to monopolize, are there any other technologies with high returns that can be introduced into the royal territory? As a second choice, there are actually many technologies to choose from. The atmosphere had been somewhat awkward, and Hansel tried his best to ease the tension. For example, the salt-making technology, compared to the traditional boiling method, can increase salt production by several times, dozens of times, or even hundreds of times. Salt is an essential seasoning for everyone, so this can generate substantial profits. There's also the loom, specifically the flying shuttle loom. One machine can be operated by one person, equivalent to 5 or 6 skilled weavers, and various agricultural implements. Although the manufacturing technology isn't shared, buying the finished products is very profitable and can greatly promote agricultural development. There's also the technology for manufacturing oarless sailing ships. Because maritime trade is developing so rapidly, merchant ships in the Northwest Bay are in short supply. I think Earl Gleman would be happy to see a new shipyard built to alleviate this situation. Oh, and there's also the technology for manufacturing honeycomb briquettes. This can greatly improve winter heating for the people in the royal territory. Although Crystal Radiance is located in the south, winters can still be cold for a while. Please vote. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 479 Spread of Ideological Trends. The course of history is independent of human will. Paul now truly understands the meaning of this statement. This morning, as soon as he sat down in his office, Hansel brought him a troublesome figure, Gold Rodney, the current king's nephew. He then explained his purpose. Paul's current predicament stemmed from this. Looking at Count Gerd, who was smiling and leisurely appraising the furnishings in his reception room, Paul felt uneasy. Importing manufacturing technology from Arda to the royal domain? Good heavens! Paul had always kept a low profile except for essential matters, fearing some powerful figure from beyond the Northwest Bay might be eyeing his territory. The Count of Arda wanted to quietly amass wealth. Technology diffusion? Of course, it was inevitable, an unstoppable historical trend, and Paul might even actively promote it when the time was right. The question was whether the time was right. Paul hoped that the diffusion of technology would be within his control. Centered on Arda, the technology would gradually spread from nearby to farther areas. Arda, as the birthplace and commanding height of technology, constantly upgrades and innovates various technologies, always leading the development trend. It always manages to reap the first benefits. Now, suddenly, the older royal family has appeared out of nowhere. Heavenly Father, with a territory and population controlled by the royal family, how abundant are their resources and talents. Once they fully understand what they've developed, as long as the ruling class takes appropriate measures and implements some necessary reforms, they can immediately push Arda and even the Northwest Bay aside to operate independently. The slightly improved Northwest Bay will once again become a small corner of the older kingdom. The course of history is not subject to human will. Paul repeated this sentence in his heart, both as a sigh and as self-consolation. Gerd observed the drawing room of the Gleman family very carefully. In his eyes, for a nobleman, the decoration and furnishings here were extremely simple. The floor was covered with an ordinary, worn carpet. The walls bore no valuable paintings, exquisite sculptures, or animal skull specimens. They were simply painted white and covered with plain brown wooden wainscoting. Of the servants he had seen since entering, excluding the guards, there were only 4, one weeding the courtyard, one sweeping the corridor, one bringing him tea, and the old butler who led him to the drawing room. If all the nobles of the Northwest Bay lived like Earl Gleman before him, then this land truly deserved the description given to it by the royal nobles, a remote, impoverished place. What was life like for a moderately wealthy southern nobleman? The servants alone included, but were not limited to, tailors, shoemakers, saddlers, carpenters, grooms, stable boys, dairy farm workers, apothecaries, musicians, actors, poets, architects, and painters. More personal servants were also necessary, such as cooks, bakers, pastry chefs, dishwashers, seamstresses who ironed clothes, and male servants who managed food and drink. At mealtimes, there were waiters specifically responsible for cutting meat and bartenders who prepared beverages. Typically, each of these jobs was performed by several people, not just one. Some servants even had assistants of varying ranks. Wealthy nobles often owned multiple residences, each typically equipped with a complete service team like the one described above. Gerd's father, Prince Jasim Rodney, had 17 male servants in his front hall. They were required to serve him day and night, always ready to perform their duties according to the prince's orders or even a simple gesture. One would fetch his master's pipe, another a glass of water, and yet another a book, and so on. In contrast, he had only seen 4 servants at the Gleman family mansion. In the context of the radiant noble circle, to describe them as poor would be an insult to the word poor. They couldn't even touch the threshold of aristocratic life. Paul noticed Gerd's scrutiny of the interior and cleared his throat awkwardly. Ahem. We Northwesterners tend to prefer a minimalist style. Actually, Paul also wanted to decorate his ancestral castle more beautifully, even if it was just by buying some expensive flowers and plants. But he had no money. Since the establishment of the public treasury, all the taxes from the territory and the profits from various industries established in the name of the state council, such as mines and ironworks, had been allocated to the public treasury. Paul retained the various manors and estates originally directly managed by the Griles family, as well as workshops established in the family name, such as the highly profitable porcelain kilns. These businesses generated enormous wealth annually, serving as a private treasury for the Griles family. While people of this era might view public and private treasuries as merely two money pouches hanging on the lord's left and right hips, after all, legally, all affairs on this land belonged to the lord, even the living people. Paul, having transmigrated from 21st century Earth, still possessed a degree of historical awareness. He intended to use the money in the public treasury for the development of the territory, and he himself would never take a single copper coin. Of course, he wasn't that noble. The private treasury was intended for his own enjoyment. But living a life of extravagance and debauchery would be a waste of his transmigration. However, the ideal is often far from reality. Arda, along with Bayhorn and Emden, is rapidly developing and requires money everywhere. Educational investment, military construction, technological research and development, urban expansion, bridge and road construction, water conservancy projects, and paying salaries to the ever-expanding administrative system are all major drains of funds. The public treasury alone is insufficient. Huge gaps are often filled in two ways. One is by issuing bonds in the private sector, which must eventually be repaid. The other is by taking money from the Gleman family's private treasury. Paul doesn't intend to have the government repay it to others. This is simply transferring money from one pocket to another. In addition, Paul occasionally needs to provide financial assistance to some struggling family branches. Each time he does this, Paul feels it should be the last time, but often a significant funding gap reappears shortly afterward. All these factors have resulted in the Lord being relatively poor now. However, he is confident that with the continued development of the Northwest Bay, the public finances, primarily based on taxes and profits from public industries, supplemented by bond issuance, will grow stronger and eventually be able to independently bear all the expenses of the territory's development. Then he could live a life of luxury with his own private treasury. With this wonderful dream in mind, the Earl worked hard day after day, year after year. Chapter 480 Spread of Ideological Trends 2. Well then, Earl Gleman, before coming to the Northwest Bay, I wasn't entirely aware of the advanced technologies it possessed, Gerd said to Paul. After arriving here, we inquired about some, and we also learned that some technologies are still under your control, such as porcelain making, and your firearms. He pulled a slip of paper from his pocket. So I've made a list first. Please take a look to see if all the technologies on it are technologies that can be shared. If you are willing to hand over these technologies to us, His Majesty the King will protect your patents in his name, not only in the royal domain, but also in all the lords within Alder. All those loyal to His Majesty will obey the King's orders to protect your patents. Gerd handed the slip of paper to Paul. Paul took the list and glanced at it. It listed paper making, salt production, canning, coke production, honeycomb briquette manufacturing, iron smelting, horse-drawn carriages, sailboat manufacturing, printing presses, looms, spinning machines, harvesters, threshing machines, chaff cutters, root cutters, mills, cotton gins. Good heavens, Paul thought to himself, are you here to raid my house? He'd basically found out everything. Honorable Earl Gled, distinguished guest, Paul addressed him directly as a guest. Currently, we can only open paper making, salt production, canning, coke production, honeycomb briquette manufacturing, spring carriage manufacturing, printing press manufacturing, and sailboat manufacturing technologies to areas outside of Arda. Other mechanical manufacturing technologies are not currently open to outsiders, but we can sell finished products. Many machines, such as looms, require hydraulic transmission devices. This is a separate technology and needs to be calculated separately. Iron smelting technology is also not open to outsiders. Coke production is done in conjunction with iron smelting, but don't worry about the coke produced in the Royal Territory being useless. You can sell it back to the Northwest Bay, where our metal smelting uses it extensively. Furthermore, we have conducted research and development on the exploration and mining technologies for iron ore, coal, and several other mineral deposits in recent years. You can import these technologies. Any minerals extracted that we cannot process ourselves can also be sold to the Northwest Bay. You can import the spring carriage manufacturing technology. But we do not open the technology for manufacturing springs. You can only purchase springs from us. Spring technology, a byproduct of researching flintlock breech blocks, initially produced flintlock breech blocks with a pitifully low firing rate. However, thanks to Paul's aggressive spending strategy and the craftsman's slow, incremental improvements, the firing rate has finally increased to its current 75%. Spring-cooled carriages, on the other hand, sell quite well, a standard feature of the upper class in the Northwest Bay. Gerd asked, how much of this so-called patent royalties do we need to pay for these technologies? Paul held up 2 fingers. Gerd asked, 2,000 silver guilders. Paul shook his head. Gerd continued, 20,000 silver guilders? That's outrageous. Paul shook his head again. Gerd, looking somewhat displeased, uttered a number he found absurd, 200,000 silver guilders. Paul finally nodded. Gerd was incredulous. Count Gleman, are you insane? Well, please forgive my rudeness, perhaps I misunderstood. Is this a buyout? That is, a one-time payment. A buyout isn't impossible. Paul shook his head. No, it's the annual usage fee. Count Arda, I have to question your loyalty to the kingdom. Are you deliberately making things difficult for me or trying to fool me? Paul adopted a serious expression and said firmly, the great Lord of Light can attest to my loyalty to the kingdom. If His Majesty were at war now, I would immediately send my most elite soldiers to help. They are all strong young men. However, these technologies are the property of my family, the Gleman family. According to the sacred laws established at the founding of the kingdom, I have the right to dispose of them as I see fit. Besides, compared to the wealth these technologies can create, what is this patent fee? A 3-masted sailing ship built with our latest shipbuilding technology, of good quality, can even sell for 100,000 silver guilders. Of course, Paul didn't mention the cost. He made a gesture of covering his face in grief. I thought the kingdom's government had recognized my loyalty during the suppression of the rebellion a few years ago. Gerd knew that this count had contributed greatly to supporting the royal army during the rebellion, providing swords, armor, rations, and other supplies. He slightly raised his head. The kingdom's government saw your loyalty, which is why it restored your family's honor. Thank you, Your Majesty. Praise Your Majesty. Haha. Actually, Paul knew that the kingdom's government hadn't been able to fight in recent years. Anyone could just offer empty words of loyalty. Gerd looked troubled and said, to be honest, Count Gleman, His Majesty's budget for purchasing technology this time isn't much. After all, it's only for experiments. Since the price is so high, then, Count Gleman, I'm sorry to have bothered you. I'll take my leave. With that, he stood up, about to leave the Lord's manor. Wait. Paul stretched out his hands to stop him from leaving. Count Gerd, I wonder if you're aware that joint stock companies are recently becoming popular in our Northwest Bay. Gerd replied, oh, isn't that just doing business together? Exactly, Paul said with a smile. Actually, I can forego patent fees and use something else instead. Gerd tilted his head. Shares, Paul confirmed. Yes, shares. Arda contributes technology as shares, while the royal domain provides capital, personnel, and land, and then dividends are distributed according to the shareholding ratio. Gerd pretended to think for a moment. That's acceptable. So, how much of a share would Your Excellency like your technology to represent? 40%, no. 35%, no. 30%, no. Paul kept lowering the price to 20% before Count Gerd reluctantly nodded. Personally, I think 20% is acceptable, but it still needs His Majesty's approval, Paul said with a smile. I believe His Majesty, with his wisdom, will certainly agree. Gerd acquired the technology without spending a penny, while Paul opened up a seemingly promising source of income without any cost. Both were quite satisfied. Of course, there were still many details to discuss, but those could be left to their subordinates. The two of them only needed to finalize the framework. Paul raised his teacup to Gerd. May our cooperation be fruitful. Gerd returned a gesture with a smile. May our cooperation go smoothly. Chapter 481. In the dimly lit living room, a faint flame flickered gently on the candle wick. The candlelight brought a sliver of light to the room, illuminating the handsome face of a young man. He lay on the table, his eyes fixed on the candlelight, his face expressionless, like a statue. Suddenly, the candlelight changed. It stopped flickering and began to rise, but at the same time, the flame thinned, like a small dough being stretched into noodles by a chef. A change occurred in the young man's expression. His brow furrowed slightly, his eyes sharpened, but he remained fixed on the light. The thin flame changed again, curving slightly, its upper half tilting slightly to the young man's left, then to his right, then back to the left, then back to the right, repeating endlessly. If someone were present and observing closely, they would see that the young man's eyes were moving, and the direction of the flame's tilt was consistent with the movement of his pupils. It seemed that the young man was controlling the flame before him. The flame tilted faster and faster from side to side, but just then, a creaking sound came from the door opening, and the tilting of the candle flame abruptly stopped. Then, with a soft bang, the candle flame turned into a ball of sparks, scattered in the air, and quickly disappeared. The hall was instantly plunged into darkness, and the candle did not reignite. Damn it, Edward, I felt like my control over the flame was about to reach a new level. A breakthrough wouldn't be an exaggeration, and now you've ruined everything. Couldn't you at least knock before coming in? The young man who had been controlling the flame said, his tone extremely annoyed. Then he snapped his fingers, and the candle that had just gone out suddenly burst into flame, quickly burning down to half its original length before returning to its normal flame. The young man looked at the candle, now only half its original length, and sighed sadly. Shut up, Nathan. You usually fail even at the slightest sound. Do you think my knocking is quiet? The man called Edward had sharp, eagle-like eyes, but his tone was somewhat flippant. This time is different. It's almost there. I'm confident. Never mind, let's not talk about that. The young man called Nathan shook his head and then asked, how did it go? Did you bring the books back? Edward picked up the kettle on the table and gulped down several mouthfuls. There were some hiccups, but thankfully they're all back. Sannel is supervising the unloading at the dock. But what? A woman's voice came, and then a woman descended the stairs. She appeared to be under 30, yet exuded a mature charm. Her features were dignified and beautiful, her figure graceful, and she possessed striking, almost dazzling red hair. Against her milky white skin, it blazed like a raging flame. Her hair was meticulously combed and styled into a neat bun at the back of her head, with a few strands cascading down her shoulders on either side. Upon closer inspection, one would notice that even her pupils were nearly red, a rare color on the continent. Mom, was Nathan's address to her. Ms. Mariana, was Edward's. If an unrelated person were present, Nathan's address to the woman would have puzzled him, as the woman's appearance suggested a sibling rather than a mother-son relationship. She was far too young. Unlike Nathan's casual address to his mother, Edward's address to her was filled with reverence. This was because Ms. Mariana was a powerful female spellcaster, and also held another identity, a member of the 10-member highest authority of the Arcane Society. Edward had only recently learned the lady's name, Mariana. Before that, he had been told to call her the Red Lady, probably because of her striking red hair. He immediately answered the lady's question. Our supplier has raised the price for subsequent orders, charging an extra 200 alder copper shields per book. Why? Edward explained. According to Sannel, the local church has influenced the Lord, and now they can only smuggle the books out through certain special means. Well, something like smuggling. In short, they can't deliver them to us openly anymore. Marianne immediately asked, how has the local church exerted influence? Has it made things difficult for the Lord there? No, madam. As far as we know, the church people simply brought the books to the Lord and mentioned them, and then the Lord ordered the books banned. Marianne continued, if our supplier continues to supply us with goods through his special means, will it cause trouble for the Lord there? Edward replied, trouble? That's certainly true. For example, we can collect taxes from these goods. I mean his relationship with the church, not really. What Lord is powerful enough to control all the lawbreakers in his territory? Everyone knows the truth. The local church is probably just asking for a response. Ms. Marianne seemed lost in thought, and Edward noticed a flicker of worry in her eyes. But it was only for a moment before she said, well, Edward, the supplier's price increase isn't a problem. Just meet their demands. Now is not the time to haggle over petty gains. Edward nodded in agreement. Yes, madam. Also, here are the sample books for this batch. He took out a book and handed it to Marianne in pairs. The lady gently stroked the brand new book, still smelling of ink, which was titled The True Story of Wrongful Convictions in Large Font Jiaoan Language. After a long while, she said with a sigh, to this day, I still don't understand how our supplier managed to do it. The font and handwriting of almost all the books are exactly the same. Was it copied by the same person? But one person obviously couldn't complete such a large workload, and even if it was copied by the same person, it's impossible for two copies to be exactly the same. Edward immediately said, "Oh, madam, perhaps I can answer that question." "You?" Marianne looked at him. "Yes, I heard it from Sanel too. He saw it from afar in the Northwest Bay." "How did this book come about?" Edward's face showed an incredulous expression. "Amazing, absolutely amazing. It wasn't copied by hand, it came from some kind of machine." Nathan, standing beside him, asked doubtfully, "Those books were manufactured by machines?" "Yes, I originally thought those books were copied by hand by a large number of people, and I was also puzzled as to why the handwriting in every book, even the arrangement of the letters, was exactly the same. But Sanel's description answered all my questions." "You mean manufactured?" No, the professional term should be printing," Edward corrected Nathan's misuse of the word. "Please vote." Chapter 482 The Horn Bay Riot. Printing. Mariana and Nathan were hearing the word for the first time. "Yes, it's printing. I never imagined books could be created this way. In the past, scribes had to copy word by word, which was easy to make mistakes. Now, with this machine, one machine can do the work of hundreds of scribes, and it's accurate every time," Edward said, gesturing excitedly. "When we went into the workshop to get the books, Sanel saw from afar that they were applying what looked like ink to a flat plate with engraved text on the machine, then placing a piece of paper on it, and then pulling down an upper platen that connected with a lower platen. These two plates pressed the paper and the engraved text together, and then the text on the paper was clear. Thinking about it carefully, this operation is indeed many times faster than copying word by word, and as long as the text on the flat plate is engraved correctly, there's no need to worry about typos or other problems. It's a clever method." Seeing his companion's expression, Nathan frowned and said, "Edward, I admit this method is ingenious, but I must remind you, you are now a spellcaster. Don't get so emotional over such trivial matters." Edward shook his head. "Nathan, that's just prejudice. We shouldn't be fixated on whether someone is a spellcaster or mortal. As long as it works, that's fine." "TCH, Nathan scoffed, dismissing Edward's point of view. "Nathan, Edward has a point. You're too arrogant. Just imagine how groundbreaking it would be if we applied this approach to scroll making," Mariana said in a reprimanding tone. Scroll making isn't just about putting words on it." Nathan didn't back down verbally in the face of his mother's criticism. Mariana waved her hand. "All right, now is not the time to argue about this. This batch of books needs to be distributed to the coastal towns as soon as possible. Edward, keep a close eye on this." "Yes, Madam Mariana. We already have very effective distributors in the important towns, so you can rest assured," Edward assured her. The woman turned to her son. "How's it going at the church?" Nathan chuckled wickedly. "Haha, they're probably in a real bind right now, like they were sitting on pins and needles." In a spacious, brightly lit hall, many people sat solemnly around a large conference table. Archbishop Elvis of Horn Bay sat at the head of the table, his face ashen. To his left sat those dressed in the robes of clergy, while to his right sat those in the ornate attire of secular nobles. "Archbishop," said a clergyman closest to Elvis, his face filled with worry, "of the 20 coastal states, 5 are still undecided, while the other 15 have clearly declared themselves our enemies. If we don't take strong measures, the Horn Bay Church will forever lose control of the coast." Hearing this, Elvis slammed his hand on the armrest of his seat. "These foolish heretics, the Lord of Light will punish them sooner or later." How did the situation turn out like this? Since the first incident of throwing something out of a window, other cities immediately followed suit, with similar incidents occurring one after another. Elvis had ordered churches throughout the region to hand over 90% of their collected taxes to Collins, the headquarters of the Horn Bay Church, but of the 20 coastal states, only 3 obediently delivered their taxes. The other churches weren't disobeying the bishop's orders, but due to the overwhelming public opinion, they almost indefinitely delayed sending their taxes. In short, the archbishop's intentions had failed. Since the beginning of this year, something even more serious had happened. A book titled The True Story of Injustice had begun to circulate quietly in Horn Bay. Elvis had come across the book, but after reading only 2 pages, he was trembling with rage. Blasphemy! Blasphemy! This filthy thing was a complete and utter blasphemy. He immediately ordered the book to be banned throughout Horn Bay and mobilized all available resources to investigate who had written it. The investigation into the book's impact was almost as intense as a witch hunt. Under such pressure, numerous authors were identified, and Elvis publicly executed several of the most suspected individuals without trial, while the rest were imprisoned. The church's method of censoring books was burning, just like burning witches. However, it wasn't just this book that was burned. The burning affected a large number of other books. Any book reported for containing criticism or dissatisfaction with the church, or even just a hint of innuendo, would be added to the censorship list. As the censorship continued, this list grew longer and longer. Ashes from burned books filled the streets and alleys of Zhao towns. Some extremist religious figures even called on believers to keep only one copy of the Bible at home and burn all other books. They believed that one Bible was sufficient to satisfy people's spiritual needs, and that any additional spiritual exploration was a shameful depravity and a sign of wavering faith. The Zhao Church began to increasingly interfere in the lives of ordinary people. The protracted witch hunt had severely impacted the economy and people's livelihoods. Now, with more and more restrictions being imposed, the resentment of the people of Zhao had reached its breaking point. People began to question the legitimacy of the Zhao Church and whether this organization could represent the authority of the Lord of Light on earth. Even so, the records of wrongful accusations continued to emerge, and its content was constantly being updated. The later entries were increasingly rich in content. This infuriated Archbishop Elvis, who repeatedly ordered intensified efforts. Under this intense pressure, a backlash finally occurred, and a riot broke out on the independent territory of Messiah. As the clergy burned a batch of forbidden books and announced the punishment of their owners, a rotten egg struck one of them on the head while he was preaching. The church knight immediately drew his sword and ordered the person who threw the rotten egg to come forward and be punished. However, this rotten egg and the knight's order acted as a fuse, instantly igniting the people's discontent. Large amounts of stones, rotten vegetables, and other garbage were hurled at the clergy. Enraged, the church knights resorted to violence during the conflict, resulting in bloodshed. The conflict quickly escalated into a city-wide riot, which even the local lord could not control. Churches in every district were attacked, and the Messiah's clergy were overwhelmingly outnumbered by the surging populace. Many clergy were wounded or killed in the attacks, while the survivors were detained. Some clergy, terrified, swore to the Lord of Light that they would prioritize loyalty to their city over the Horn Bay Church. These individuals were released, while those who remained loyal to the Horn Bay Church were brutally beaten and expelled from Messiah. Chapter 483 The Papal Envoy. After the first large-scale riot against a church broke out in Messiah, the horn of the church headquarters in Collins reacted swiftly, immediately drawing armed forces from various regions to form a protectorate army to suppress the rebellion in Messiah. At that time, the coastal nations and the church were not yet formally hostile, and the church's army could still move freely among the nations. Thus, the church's army easily reached the capital city of Messiah, and the people of Messiah, upon hearing the news, hurriedly came out of the city to fight against the church's army. However, the armed force that Messiah could send at this time was only an army with a corps of a few knights dissatisfied with the church, and most of its members were conscripted militia. The most prestigious anti-church knight, Sir Richardson, became the backbone of the Messiah side. The Lord of the Messiah Independent Territory, caught between an enraged and out-of-control populace and a church that had taken a hard line by directly sending troops, felt that he could not afford to offend either side, and fled elsewhere with his confidants. But how could a hastily assembled army possibly contend with the church's army, which had been used for years to suppress witches? Moreover, the coastal nations' military forces were more adept at naval warfare, while the church's troops were mostly from inland countries like Collins, skilled in land combat. Outside Messiah's capital, the two armies clashed for 2 hours before a decisive victory was decided. Messiah's side suffered a crushing defeat and hastily retreated into the city. However, due to poor organization, the retreat quickly turned into a rout, with panicked soldiers even blocking the city gates. Seeing this, the church army, risking an ambush, ordered a full-scale assault. They were right, this wasn't a messianic ploy, but a genuine defeat. Messiah's gates were captured by the church army before they could even be closed. In this era, the change of city gates essentially signaled the end of the siege, and Messiah quickly fell entirely into the hands of the church army. The church's army conducted a massive manhunt throughout the city, arresting a large number of those involved in the riot, then publicly executing them in the square. Sir Richardson, who commanded the army, was particularly humiliated. His head was severed and hung on a pillar in the square to dry in the sun. Even letters of pleas for mercy from the Messianic Lord and the rulers of several neighboring countries were to no avail. The day of the mass executions was July 19th in the Hornby calendar, hence it is known as the July 19th massacre. The spirits of the Messianic people were deeply wounded. Although the first fire was extinguished, embers still held sparks, ready to reignite given the right conditions. Under the oppressive atmosphere, Hornby was rife with undercurrents, and various dissident organizations dissatisfied with the church sprang up like mushrooms after rain. The deceased Sir Richardson became the common spiritual leader of these organizations. Remember Richardson, remember July 19th, this became their shared motto. In this situation, the church's original witch hunts had completely lost popular support. Coupled with the fueling of the records of wrongful convictions, more and more people believe that the church merely wanted to use these so-called witch hunts to suppress dissent and seize the wealth of the innocent. The Duchy of Eaton was the first to stand up, stating that any action by the church within its territory required the approval and supervision of the Grand Duchy's government, otherwise, it would be illegal. This included investigations, trials, and punishments of witches and heretics. Archbishop Elvis was furious and immediately declared he would mobilize troops to repeat the actions taken against the Duchy of Eaton in Messiah. However, a second and third country followed suit, issuing statements indicating they would take the same measures as the Duchy of Eaton. Finally, even the most powerful nation in Hornby, the Hornby Alliance, sided with the Duchy of Eaton. This immense conflict even caused a split within the church, with a large number of clergy from coastal countries breaking away from the church and publicly declaring they would no longer obey the Hornby Church's instructions. They rallied together, supported each other, and reorganized according to the original church's internal structure, calling themselves Protestants and referring to their former church as the Old Church, signifying a complete break. The leader of this Protestant sect was none other than Angelo, the Bishop of Nice, a key figure in the first incident involving being thrown out of a window. It was he who represented the Nice clergy in opposing the transfer of 90% of the tithes to Collins. The church's envoy decided to arrest him and take him to Collins for punishment. Upon hearing this, the enraged people of Nice stormed the cathedral and threw the envoy out of the window. This situation was unexpected for Elvis. He had assumed it was just a few troublemakers, but he hadn't anticipated so many nations uniting against the church, even a large number of clergy standing against him. Of course, in the bishop's eyes, this so-called Protestant sect was nothing but heresy, utterly defiled. But Elvis was caught in a dilemma regarding whether to wage war against Eaton. And just then, the papacy once again sent an envoy to Nice. A heavy blow. To deal with these heretics who have strayed from the Father's teachings, we must strike hard to bring the ignorant people of the coast back to the right path. Lord Elvis, please lead us into war against these heretics. In the council hall of the Hornby Church, a crowned man sitting to Elvis's right shouted loudly. He was King Segovia II of Collins. Collins was the most vocal in its advocacy of a hardline approach against the coastal nations among the inland countries of Hornby. From nobles to commoners, the desire for war was extremely strong. As the headquarters of the Hornby Church, everyone in Collins took pride in living in a place directly illuminated by the Father's glory. However, due to geographical limitations, Collins was not as wealthy as the coastal nations. This spiritual superiority and material backwardness led to a strong psychological dissonance among the people of Collins. They viewed the coastal residents as vulgar nouveau riche, while secretly coveting their immense wealth. Your Majesty, please calm down. One of the clergy sitting to Elvis's left stood up. He had a kind face, gray hair, a face full of wrinkles, and a sparse beard. The purpose of the papacy sending me and Anthony to Cape Bay is to make one last effort. War, no one wants it to happen. Once war breaks out, how many mothers will lose their sons, how many wives will lose their husbands, how many children will lose their fathers? The papacy's envoy, Ledbetter, who had just arrived in Collins, looked around at everyone and slowly stated his views. How much unnecessary suffering and tragedy will be added to the world? I think this is something our merciful Heavenly Father does not want to see. Therefore, I will travel with Anthony to the coastal countries to pray for the continuation of peace and to prevent the outbreak of war. Chapter 484 The Papal Envoy 2. Your Excellency, I disagree with you. Seeing that the papal envoy still wanted to negotiate, King Collins was extremely agitated. He puffed out his chest, his eyes wide, and stood up angrily. Then, In a booming voice, he said, "We have waited with the utmost patience for the coastal nations to change their minds, but each act of forbearance and concession has only brought us humiliation. Now is the final moment, the moment when we retreat to the edge of a precipice. If we retreat one more step, we will inevitably fall off the cliff, and the glory of the Lord of Light will fall from the glorious heavens to the bottomless abyss of darkness." Hearing King Colin's words, the papal envoy, Libert, almost lost control of his emotions and wanted to retort on the spot, "To hell with your forbearance and concessions." He wanted to ask Segovia you and your Archbishop Elvis, can your actions be called forbearance and concessions? The purpose of witch hunts should be to keep people vigilant against witchcraft, focusing on education and warning, not endless burning of people. This kind of thing is all about moderation. It should stop when it's done right. Why expand it again and again? A once prosperous trading hub, a well-known and bustling place, has been turned into a chaotic mess by you. Both local and foreign merchants are living in fear and trembling with fear. Which coastal country doesn't rely on trade for its livelihood? Now you've destroyed their livelihood, don't you think they'll fight you to the death? Expanding the scope a little is one thing, but who gave you permission to target those powerful nobles? Good heavens, you even dared to arrest the sister-in-law of the Duke of Eton. Don't you know that even the papacy is always careful in handling its relationship with powerful nobles? Your so-called patience and concessions are nothing more than repeated ultimatums, which are clearly serious provocations in their eyes. His constant use of an imperious tone and condescending attitude is unpleasant to anyone who hears it. In fact, the current pope has no intention of launching a witch hunt. After thousands of years of suppression, magic and witchcraft have long become rural legends, and the occasional sporadic reports are often highly questionable in their veracity. Of course, as one of the people in the papacy who possesses the most secrets, His Holiness the Pope and his higher-ranking officials are well aware of the undeniable existence of witchcraft and know that a considerable number of practitioners are lurking in the shadows. However, as long as those practitioners obediently remain in the shadows for their entire lives, obediently wearing masks, His Holiness the Pope has no desire to expend the effort to root them out and eliminate them. After all, the total damage caused to humanity by rats and locusts far exceeds that of witchcraft, and humanity cannot eradicate rats and locusts. If any foolish wizard dares to cause trouble, the nearby Inquisition should handle it discreetly, controlling the scope of the situation. The fewer people who know, the easier it is for the Church to deal with it. The more people who know, the more troublesome it becomes. Maintaining this tacit understanding is ideal, isn't it? But what does it mean for Elvis to do something so blatantly, as if he wants everyone to know? Previously, those witchcraft manipulators acted alone, and lone wolves were easy to deal with. Now, under such pressure, they will inevitably form organizations and unite to counter the Church's threat, making the wolf pack much more difficult to handle. However, the Pope cannot openly oppose the actions of the Corner Bay Church, because the rejection of witchcraft is one of the fundamental principles of the papacy. Rashly ordering the Corner Bay Church to stop its spontaneous witch hunts would cause ideological chaos among churches throughout the continent and might even shake the authority of the papacy. After Elvis launched his movement in Corner Bay, the Pope could only send several groups to guide the Corner Bay Church on how to distinguish between wizards and ordinary people, doing everything possible to avoid harming innocent civilians. However, as if some unseen force was at play, the situation always seemed to calm down only to escalate rapidly again. Of course, the almost irrational religious fanaticism of the local church, led by Elvis, provided fertile ground for these recurring fluctuations. Now, the very thing the papacy feared most had happened. The expansion of the witch hunts had aroused resentment from secular authorities and the people. People were questioning the Church's motives, which in turn could shake the dominant position of the Church of Light in the realm of human thought. Libert sighed inwardly. Although he wanted to voice his dissatisfaction, as an envoy of the papacy, he had to maintain necessary composure and could not possibly make a scene in this setting. He began, "Your Majesty Segovia II." However, before he could continue, he was interrupted by Elvis, who sat at the head of the table. "Enough. Stop arguing." His beard trembled slightly, as if he were exerting great effort to control his emotions. "I agree with His Excellency Liberty's opinion, to let him make an effort for the peace of Horn Bay." But, his gaze turned sinister, quite incongruous with his status as Archbishop. "This is truly the last time. If the coastal nations cannot immediately return to the glory of the Lord of Light, then they can only await his wrath." With that, The archbishop abandoned the crowd and stormed off. Segovia II gave Livermore a disapproving look and also stood up and left. Livermore excused himself and left his seat to return to his quarters. The important figures of the meeting had all departed, and the remaining attendees also left in twos and threes. Cardinal Anthony, who had accompanied Livermore as a papal envoy, hurriedly stood up and chased after Livermore. Anthony caught up with Livermore and walked alongside him. Lowering his voice, he said, "Lord Ledbetter, is it really necessary to go?" "I feel it will be futile," Ledbetter replied in an equally low voice. "To be honest, I don't have high hopes for this trip either." "But we still have to go," Anthony asked in confusion. "Why?" "The most important thing is to make a statement, to draw a line between the papacy and the Corner Bay Church, to let others know that we are us, and they are them. Even if the papacy is ultimately dragged into the war by the Corner Bay Church, we must leave a channel for later negotiations." "Negotiations? If we personally intervene, can't we guarantee victory over those merchants?" Ledbetter shook his head. "If I were a general, with the papacy's strength, I believe I would be confident of victory, but I am also a diplomat now, and I must prepare for all possibilities, even those that are infinitely close to zero." Chapter 485 Special Envoy of the Holy See 3. Hearing Ledbetter's words, Anthony showed a look of regret and pain. "My lord, it's all my fault. When we were considering candidates for the new Archbishop of Horn Bay, I supported Elvis. I never imagined that after he actually became Archbishop, he would make such a mess of Horn Bay." Ledbetter's previously tense face softened into a smile as he comforted the young cardinal. "Oh, my dear Anthony, there's no need to blame yourself so much. The appointment of the Archbishop of Horn Bay was the result of comprehensive consideration by the Holy See. Haven't you heard that the reason Elvis was chosen was because he was the most rational among a group of madmen? If it had been someone else, who knows what Horn Bay would be like now?" Ledbetter sighed softly. "Alice, this is probably the inevitable course of history. Even if we had supported a relatively rational bishop to take the throne, the situation still developed in a way we didn't want to see. It can only be said that in this place, Horn Bay, various contradictions are intricately intertwined, mutually reinforcing and ultimately giving birth to the monstrous offspring of war. Look, the poverty of inland countries versus the wealth of coastal countries, the power demands of the church versus those of secular rulers, the openness brought about by commercial development versus the conservatism naturally supported by religion. None of these are easy to resolve. Elvis just happened to become Archbishop at this time, but whether Elvis is in the position can only bring forward or delay the current situation. No matter who is in power, it's impossible to resolve all the contradictions. So-called war is the culmination of these contradictions." Just as he finished speaking, the papal envoy saw a hint of doubt flash in Anthony's eyes. "What is it?" "My dear Anthony," the over 50-year-old Ledbetter greatly valued the young man before him, the youngest cardinal priest, whose future was limitless. He was very happy to answer this young man's questions. "Oh, no, it's nothing." Anthony shook his head slightly and said, "I just find it difficult to immediately grasp your profound insights due to my own dullness." Ledbetter laughed and said, "These aren't profound insights, just the experience gained from living for decades. When you're old enough, you'll naturally understand these things." Anthony then asked, "Since you think the situation is so pessimistic, and its development is somewhat uncontrollable, why did you risk hostility by making that trip?" Ledbetter didn't answer immediately. He looked up at the sky, which was already a dusky yellow. The sun had already set halfway, and night was fast approaching. After a long while, Ledbetter said, "Perhaps it's because I always believe that everyone still harbors a last shred of rationality." Then the two fell silent, walked side by side for a distance, and parted ways at the corner of the corridor. Watching Ledbetter's departing figure, Anthony muttered almost inaudibly to himself, "Your Excellency, the purpose of my following you to Horn Bay was to shatter your so-called last vestige of rationality." In the office of the Speaker of the High Council of Niceburg, Speaker Marcus and several heavyweight councillors were discussing a letter, including Joe Foster, the patriarch of the Foster family. The Speaker asked, "My friends, how much sincerity do you think Lord Ledbetter has brought?" Foster replied, "Marcus, even if he comes with the utmost sincerity, I don't think it will be of any use. Unless, Speaker, unless the papacy directly orders the Horn Bay Church to cease its witch hunts and stop interfering in the internal affairs of the riverine states. The fire has already been lit, adding more dirt to it won't do any good." "That seems unlikely," the Speaker sighed. "Don't harbor any illusions. Prepare for war. Horus, a counselor advocating a hardline stance against the church, rubbed his hands together, eager for battle. Now is our final moment. We are on the edge of a cliff. If we retreat even one more step, we will fall into an abyss, along with the glory of the Hornby Alliance, and the wealth left to us by our ancestors and the wealth we have accumulated ourselves. All of this will vanish in the instant we fall. Horus was so excited because his family was involved in the slave trade, and war was the most effective way to quickly acquire a large number of slaves. The council members had not anticipated that anti-church sentiment would rise so quickly. After much thought, they concluded that the mysterious book, The True Story of Wrongful Convictions, written by an unknown author, was a major driving force. Anyone with a conscience would grit their teeth at the church after reading this book. Moreover, there was a very clever aspect to the book's theme. It did not oppose the Lord of Light, the universally worshipped deity of all nations, something that might deter adults from even reading the book, but instead separated the Lord of Light from the papacy, and the churches under its jurisdiction, dividing them into two independent entities. The book, in its criticism of the Vatican, extensively quotes classical passages from the Bible. The author's theological expertise is astounding, and the entire book suggests that the Vatican's actions contradict the very Bible it so vehemently proclaims. The book boldly raises several questions. What gives the Vatican the right to represent the Lord of Light? What gives the Vatican the right to monopolize the interpretation of the Bible? Is the Vatican using the banner of the Lord of Light to violate the Bible? These questions have a profound impact on believers. For centuries, the Vatican has been almost synonymous with the Lord of Light. The Vatican is seen as the embodiment of the Father's power on earth, the holder of the Father's authority. Previously, no one had questioned the Vatican's qualifications to represent the Lord of Light. Now, this data-rich and profoundly insightful book has planted seeds of doubt in people's hearts. With the recent diligent efforts of the Zhaoan Church, these seeds have quickly sprouted and grown larger. Its growth resulted in the emergence of a new sect, with a large number of original church members openly breaking away from the Hornby Church and establishing a new organization. The council also wanted to investigate who had written the book, but ultimately could only find that it came from the Northwest Bay. When they inquired with the printing press that produced the book, they refused to answer, citing a confidentiality agreement with their clients. Later, the book was banned by the Lords of Arda, yet its circulation in Hornby continued to grow rapidly. Perhaps someone had purchased an Arda printing press and started printing it themselves. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 486 Military Equipment. Very well, if Lord Ledbetter is coming, we welcome him. But we must be prepared for war. Council Chairman Marcus finally made his decision. He turned to Joe Foster. My friend, how about you take on the task of entertaining him? I'm willing to take on this difficult task. Foster nodded. The chairman then asked, now, could you please give everyone a briefing on our armaments? The Hornby Alliance's weapons were mainly purchased from the Northwest Bay. Initially, the Alliance didn't want to rely too much on the Northwest Bay, but unfortunately, the weapons sold there were simply too good to be true. The price of forging a sword at home or buying it elsewhere could buy 5 to 10 swords in the Northwest Bay, and the quality was quite good. This led the Hornby Alliance to become increasingly reliant on the Northwest Bay when expanding its armory. Everyone wanted to get more for less. The council members couldn't figure out how the Northwest Bay could drive down prices so low, especially for iron, a crucial raw material for forging weapons. Did iron in the Northwest Bay magically appear out of the ore? Foster cleared his throat and said confidently, colleagues, although the Church of Hornby will most likely have the support of the Vatican if war breaks out, we are well prepared to offset this advantage. First, there is armor. We currently have 30,000 sets of metal armor, including more than 3,000 sets of high-grade armor, and more than 50,000 sets of leather armor. Even if we expand to the maximum of 150,000 men, we can still achieve at least a 50% armoring rate. Second, there is weaponry. Currently, the armories in various places have a total of 100,000 spears, 30,000 one-handed swords, 10,000 longbows, and 30,000 shortbows. Regarding large machinery, we have built 100 crossbows, 30 large catapults, 100 small catapults, siege engines. In terms of animal power, We have a total of more than 35,000 horses and 10,000 mules. Regarding food, the arms trade with the Northwest Bay was mainly conducted by the eldest son of Marcus Foster. The Marcus was also very concerned about this matter. Before this meeting, he specifically wrote down all the data on paper. A short while later, the Marcus Foster finished reading the various statistics on the paper. He concluded, if we arm our army according to these figures, we will create an army unlike any in the history of Horn Bay. Even outside Horn Bay, an army of this size is rare. Moreover, thanks to weapons from the Northwest Bay, we will truly arm every soldier as a lethal weapon, not a group of rugged militia with pitchforks. Our army's organizational structure is extremely advanced. When recruiting soldiers, all that's needed is for them to come. The government will provide standardized weapons and armor and conduct training. Our inland neighbors, on the other hand, require their soldiers to provide their own weapons. Furthermore, we have reached agreements with the major mercenary groups in Horn Bay. They are all willing to accept our employment, whenever we need it. Of course, hearing Foster's eloquent explanation of the military situation, everyone in the speaker's office felt their confidence greatly increased. Horace excitedly waved his fist. That's right. That's how you should respond to a fist with a fist, a sword with a sword. The church's army will be terrified of the allies when they're giving it their all. But, he suddenly frowned. Speaking in a cautionary tone, we must be wary of traitors, especially those who constantly talk about the church. Hearing this, everyone chuckled inwardly. They all knew Horace was referring to Pius Simmons, a devout counselor who was usually at odds with Horace. Recently, due to the tensions between the allies and the church, he had been staying home and rarely attended council meetings. At this moment, a counselor suddenly asked, when fighting on land, has our fleet been assigned any combat missions? The question was met with a burst of laughter, making everyone blush. Did those inland bumpkins even have warships? Did they need to discuss fleet issues when dealing with a bunch of landlubbers? Speaker Marcus answered his question, although you may not take it seriously, I am still prepared to raise 100 warships as a precaution. A large number of combat-capable ships are already registered and will no longer be on long voyages. If needed, our ports can assemble at least 50 well-manned ships within 3 days. An emergency, Horace asked. Does that mean we are preparing for our allies to betray us and defect to the church? The speaker replied, Oh, Mr. Horace, don't be so malicious in your speculation about our allies with whom we have signed a defensive agreement. I trust the integrity and character of our allies' leaders. What I'm worried about is their level of military preparedness. They might not be as well prepared as we are. Once one of their ports is captured from land, then our merchant ships will be threatened. If they have the money, they can still recruit a group of sea outlaws. Furthermore, Speaker Marcus said, looking around at the crowd, we must be wary of the Vatican's threat. Although their port is quite far from us, we still can't afford to be careless. Achoo, a militiaman on duty sneezed, feeling a little dizzy. He covered his nose, blew it, and casually touched the brick wall next to his post. This was a border checkpoint of the Horn Bay Alliance, which hadn't existed before but had been added 6 months ago. Since the conflict with the church became public, the Horn Bay Alliance had built many such checkpoints along the border, a 5 or 6 meter high watchtower made of wood or brick, with a small hut for the garrison to rest. A checkpoint was usually manned by only 2 or 3 guards or local militiamen. Their purpose was not defense but vigilance. The militiaman on duty felt unlucky, he had caught a cold, but his request to go home to rest had been rejected. It was all because of this damned situation. What's that? The guard's pupils quickly focused on the distance along the road. This was once a trade route, carrying most of the commercial transport between the Horn Bay Alliance and the landlocked Principality of Sealand. However, since the situation deteriorated, the road has become increasingly deserted, and now only rabbits can be seen darting from side to side. But now, a caravan has appeared on this road, which had been deserted all day. Was the landlocked country about to invade? The militiamen were on high alert, their eyes wide as they strained to see in that direction. Please vote. Chapter 487 Assassination. The militiaman watched the approaching travelers on the distant trade route. Just as he was considering whether to immediately light the signal fire, the uninvited guests gradually became clearer in his sight. Not an army. If not an army, could it be a merchant caravan? Which fellow would be so bold as to brazenly cross the border at this time? Even if they were smuggling, they should have taken those less-known trails. He observed carefully and finally saw the banner the caravan was carrying. It was the banner of the church. Yes, the banner bore a flame pattern embroidered in gold thread, the emblem of the Father. The militiaman considered for a moment, then opened the pigeon coop hanging on the watchtower and took out a gray and white pigeon. Disturbed from its meal, the pigeon reluctantly flapped its wings, wobbled into the sky, and flew south. If it's an invasion, light the signal fire. If it's envoys, release the pigeon. A beautifully designed and elegantly decorated four-wheeled carriage, pulled by two fine horses, gradually approached a checkpoint. Surrounding the carriage were 10 fully armed knights, each tall and robust, clad in magnificent armor and helmets. Militiamen rushed down from the watchtower and removed the roadblocks. The procession stopped, and 2 knights rode forward to greet the militiamen. "My lords," the militiaman bowed respectfully. Despite his many grievances against the church, he felt it best to be polite to 10 highly skilled church knights. "We are envoys sent by the papacy. Please have your superior come and meet us," one of the knights said, his voice muffled by the hood. "My lords, unfortunately, my captain has taken the rest on patrol." The word papacy did not attract the militiaman's attention. In most people's minds, the papacy and the church were no different. "In that case, we shall continue." The knight flicked his whip, preparing to cross the checkpoint. "Oh, no," the militiaman struggled to suppress his fear and mustered his courage to speak. "We were instructed to wait here. A distinguished gentleman from the council is in the nearest town. He'll be here soon after receiving the message. At most," he held up 2 fingers, 2 hours at most. Actually, the militiaman's heart was pounding. What if that foolish messenger bird had flown off somewhere else to find food? It seemed it hadn't eaten enough when it was released. The captain should have left another person behind, the militiaman grumbled inwardly. "How dare you?" Sure enough, the expected thunderbolt descended quickly. The knight who had spoken earlier swung his whip forcefully, making the militiaman feel as if it would strike him any second. "You lowly commoner, making the envoy wait in your doghouse. Do you want to taste the whip?" Terrified, the militiaman immediately closed his eyes, then hunched over, tensing his muscles, bracing himself for the whip. This was an instinct. Most commoners had this instinct in front of nobles. "Stop," a voice from the carriage saved the militiaman from a meeting. The militiaman looked gratefully at the carriage, the door creaked open, and a tall young man stepped out first, followed by an elderly man a head shorter than him. Judging from the young man's respectful attitude, this elderly man must be the envoy. The old man said, "I'm tired of sitting, so I'll rest here for a while." He looked kindly at the militiaman. "It's a bit windy outside. If you allow me, please sit in your house." The militiaman immediately replied, "Sir, of course, if you don't mind." "Of course, I guarantee it's clean inside," the old man said to the knights. "I need to stay quietly for a while. Please don't disturb me." "Oh, Anthony, come in. Perhaps I have some questions to discuss with you." Then he and the young man followed the militiaman to the house. Anthony entered the small hut for the guards to rest first, and finding nothing unusual, slipped aside to let liberty in. After Ledbetter settled into a chair, he said, "My lord, I'll go out and give our knights a heads up, lest the allied people arrive and become too abrupt. You know the current situation." Ledbetter nodded. "You're right, we should remind them." "Go ahead." Anthony turned to the militiaman still standing at the door and said, "Go fetch a bucket of water so the envoy can wash away the dust of his journey." The militiaman pointed to a wooden bucket in the corner. "My lord, there's one right here." Anthony's face hardened, and he raised his voice. "Watch your tone, guard. You mean you want the papacy's envoy to wash his hands and face with the water you've used?" The militiaman jumped in fright. "I'll go right away. Hurry up, and don't forget to scrub the bucket." The militiaman carried the bucket out, and Anthony followed. Ledbetter closed his eyes, his thoughts gradually focusing on the upcoming negotiations. How could he persuade the Hornby Alliance? The alliance is the most powerful among the coastal nations. As long as the alliance can set aside its hostility, other countries will be no problem. What concessions should I make? On which issues should I absolutely not back down? Ledbetter carefully considered each potential problem in the negotiations, devising strategies. He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he didn't even notice someone entering the room. When the sensation on his neck and the subsequent feeling of suffocation assaulted his brain, it was too late. By the time Ledbetter realized someone was attacking him, a strong hand was already tightly gripping his throat, and another hand was covering his mouth so tightly and forcefully that not a sound could be uttered. The instinct for survival still made him struggle, but the more he struggled, the less strength he had. because he couldn't breathe. Upon recognizing the attacker, he was shocked and filled with both sorrow and pity. He didn't know whether he felt pity for himself or for the attacker. Just when he thought he might die of suffocation, a sharp pain struck from behind, and Ledbetter instantly lost all his strength. Blood flowed from the wound on his back, further blurring his already oxygen-deprived consciousness. Is there someone else? Liberty thought, still with his mouth and nose covered and his throat choked. Sigh, never mind, that's it. This was the last thought that flashed through Liberty's mind before his body completely lost its life. The church knights waited idly outside. Priest Antoninus came out and gathered them together. Be polite when the allied officials arrive. Lord Liberty held high hopes for this negotiation. The priest warned them. Negotiation, negotiation. Negotiation, my foot. This was the thought of many knights. But they dared not disobey their superiors' orders. The militiaman came out carrying a bucket, fetched a bucket of water from a distant lake, and went back into the hut. He had already been searched. And the priest was watching over him inside, so the knights weren't worried. Then a roar filled with grief and pain erupted from the hut. Sinner! Do you know what you're doing? The power was so great that even the birds nearby took flight. The same thought flashed through everyone's mind. This is terrible. Something horrific has happened. Please vote. Chapter 488, Questioning the Guilty. What happened when Marcus Joe Foster, as the person in charge of receiving the papacy's envoy, arrived at the border outpost? The scene before him shocked him. A corpse, judging by its attire, that of an allied militiaman, was hanging upside down from the watchtower, swaying in the wind. Several other militiamen had also been killed and carelessly dumped below the tower. Below the watchtower stood 3 church knights, each armed with a sharp blade. They were all on high alert, their swords gleaming coldly in the sunlight. Upon seeing Marcus Foster's arrival, one of the knights rode up to within 10 meters of him. Marcus Foster spoke first. I am Joe Foster, a member of the council, and I demand a reasonable explanation. His brow was furrowed, and his shoulders trembled slightly, clearly struggling to control his agitated emotions. Provocation. This was a grave provocation. The papacy's envoy, under the guise of negotiations, had come to the Hornby Alliance's territory and killed allied militiamen. This act was both deception and an insult. Marcus Foster, the knight speaking nearby, said, his face obscured by a veiled helmet. I am ordered to remain in this sinful place to inform you that the despicable and shameless actions of the Hornby Alliance have thoroughly envied the Hornby Church and the papacy. We will consider this the most serious insult and provocation. You and your poor allies will face the Church's harshest punishment. What? This is utterly outrageous. For a moment, Marcus Foster felt it was all too absurd. You came to our territory, killed people, and then called it provocation. But he still patiently asked, I wonder what kind of provocation this knight is referring to? Let me guess, you mean our militia didn't obediently await their deaths when faced with your swords but chose to resist, and in your eyes that's provocation, is that it, Marcus Foster? Are you still pretending to be confused? The knight asked, filled with grief and indignation. Pretending to be confused, Marcus Foster sensed that the knight's grief and indignation were genuine, and doubt arose in his heart once again. The knight shouted, wasn't it the Hornby Alliance who sent assassins to ambush and brutally murder Lord Livermore, the papal envoy? What did you say? Foster could hardly believe his ears. Livermore, murdered? And by one of their own? If you didn't hear me clearly, I'll repeat myself. Lord Livermore was brutally murdered by assassins from the Hornby Alliance, right there in that little hut. The knight pointed with his riding crop to the hut where Livermore had rested. Of course, I suspect you know the whole story better than I do, because this was originally your evil plan. This was a serious matter. Marcus Joe Foster felt as if he had fallen into an icy abyss. It wasn't that he feared the impending war, but this incident before the war, if the blame were firmly placed on them, would put the Hornby Alliance in a morally disadvantageous position. Foster said urgently, Leader. Where is Leader's body? I need to see it. There must be something wrong here. The knight scoffed, huffing. How can Lord Leader's body remain here for you sinners to desecrate? He has already been taken to Collins. Foster retorted, there must be something wrong here, Your Excellency. I urge you to regain your senses as a knight of the faith. Consider this, in this situation, what good would killing the papal envoy do us? If we wanted to negotiate, the serious consequences of killing the envoy are self-evident. And if we wanted to wage war, killing the envoy wouldn't bring us immediate victory. Instead, it would incite your shared hatred. Therefore, in any case, we have no motive to kill the leader. You're still trying to argue." The knight's anger seemed to burst forth like flames through his helmet visor. He gripped his sword hilt tightly, his body tense with tension, as if he would thrust the sword forward with all his might at any moment. The Marquis's guards noticed the knight's change in demeanor. With a series of clanging sounds, they drew their swords, preparing to ambush their master in the face of the enraged knight. The knight ultimately refrained from attacking, instead stating, "Our men witnessed your assassin plunge the wicked poison dagger into the envoy's back. The facts are undeniable. It must be you despicable rulers who deceive those citizens who still wish to follow the true path of faith, fearing Lord Liberty's exposure of your lies, and thus resorting to such a vile and shameless means as assassination." The knight was convinced of his suspicions. Foster was about to defend his side, but the knight rudely waved his hand. "Enough, Marcus Foster, I have no patience to waste here arguing with you. The Almighty Father has already seen through some of these sins, and you will surely pay the price for your despicable acts. Brothers, let's go back and report." With that, the knight sharply shook the reins, and his horse turned and galloped off into the distance along the trade route. The other two knights spurred their steeds, following the first knight. They left Marcus Foster with only a trail of dust. Joe Foster's face was ashen. Who had orchestrated this assassination? He didn't doubt the knight's words, that Ledbetter had been killed, were false. Ledbetter was a high-ranking priest in charge of diplomacy within the papacy. If the Corner Bay Church or the papacy were to fabricate the murder of such a high-ranking figure to gain a pretext for war or to seize the moral high ground, it would be a laughingstock. Therefore, Ledbetter was undoubtedly murdered. So who did it? The Corner Bay Church? Very likely, it was full of fanatical lunatics. Hardliners from allied or ally nations? That's also possible. Many had been preparing for this war for a long time, just waiting to profit from the chaos. Those inland nations that supported the Corner Bay Church? They were the most likely culprit. Inland people had always coveted the wealth of the coast, and they had always wanted to use the church's banner to plunder the coastal riches. Now is not the time to reason about these things. We must inform the council immediately. After all, war is about to break out. Filled with doubt, the Marcus Foster lashed his horse with his whip, and the horse neighed in pain, galloping off in the direction it had come from. The Marquis's squires followed closely behind. Both sides had left. Only the silent corpses of the militiamen remained, hanging upside down from the tower, swaying in the wind. Chapter 489 August Gerd. Is this what they call a flying shuttle loom? Inside a weaving factory, Gerd Rodney's eyes were fixed on the flying shuttle shuttling back and forth. He had been in the Northwest Bay for almost a month, visiting various factories almost every day. With the shuttles back and forth, a piece of cloth was rapidly taking shape on the machine. "Yes, Your Excellency," Paul, standing beside Gerd Rodney as his companion, confirmed for him. "It's a very ingenious little gadget," Gerd said with great emotion. "Even to a layman like me, its principle isn't complicated. I never imagined that such a simple improvement could increase the efficiency of cloth production so much," Paul chimed in. "Many technologies aren't that profound, they just sit there quietly, waiting for someone to have a flash of inspiration," Gerd said with a touch of regret. "Since it's so simple, I could easily give you so many shares and just take a look here before going back to gather craftsmen to replicate it." "Oh, you can't say that, Lord Gerd," Paul raised an eyebrow. "If we have a good partnership, you can also enjoy our future technology upgrade services." "Technology upgrade?" "Yes, believe it or not, in my laboratory, there are even more advanced technologies than what you see here. If the technology before you is stolen, I will immediately upgrade it, using higher production efficiency to drive the thief out of the market. And partners who come through the proper channels will enjoy the benefits of upgrading together." "You're very confident, Earl Gleman," Paul shrugged, looking confident. "I'm just that confident." "All right." Gerd didn't continue the conversation on this topic. He looked at Paul. "So, regarding the shuttle technology, was it you who had the flash of inspiration, Count Gleman?" Paul smiled shyly and said humbly, "Although it was me, the completion of the specific details still relied on Mr. Guyburns and his colleagues at the machine shop." "Guyburns? Wait, I think I've heard that name before." Something suddenly flashed through Gerd's mind, and then he fell into reverie. "Guyburns? Burns," he kept muttering to himself. Paul smiled and waited for him to recall. Guyburns was from the capital and came from a noble family. Count Gerd knew him quite well. But he didn't intend to remind Gerd, Sometimes recalling vague memories was a kind of fun. Haha, I remember now, Gerd slapped his forehead. A mechanical engineer from Jingai-ao, though his abilities were rather mediocre, had a unique style. He refused to make toys for nobles and instead taught his skills to poor children. Eventually, he was boycotted by the mechanical engineers of Jingai-ao and, unable to make a living there, went elsewhere to seek a living. Ah. Paul Gleman, is your guy Burns from Jingai-ao? After all, there are many people with the same name. Paul laughed heartily and said, I think it is this Mr. Guy Burns. His experience is exactly the same as yours. However, I cannot agree with the assessment that his abilities were mediocre. Many of the machines here were made by this Master Burns. Gerd was very surprised. Is his ability exceptionally outstanding? But I heard, oh. Your Excellency, Paul waved his hand. You yourself said that the mechanics in the capital are keen on making toys for nobles, but Master Burns disdains such things. His ambition is to make big things, like this flying shuttle loom before us. A machine that can multiply production efficiency, Paul continued sarcastically, haha, it seems the nobles of the capital have lost a great talent, but have driven him to the Northwest Bay. Just imagine, if he had stayed in the capital, perhaps I would be here right now, buying technology and machines from you, Earl Gerd. Earl Gerd held his right hand up to his eyes, rubbing his thumb and fingers together, and said with a smile, you still need a little bit of a flash of inspiration, don't you? The two looked at each other and burst into laughter. After laughing, Paul asked, Lord Gerd, are you also interested in mechanical technology? Why do you ask? You seemed quite familiar with Mr. Burns's story, which suggests you're an insider. Oh. It's not because I'm interested in mechanical technology, Gerd answered honestly. Actually, it's because my brother is very interested in mechanics. I heard about Mr. Burns from him. He's, or as you would say, a semi-insider. Your brother, Paul asked, Lord August? Or Lord Yuriko? It's August, Gerd replied. He's very interested in things like mechanics. He's been going to your machine shop and farm machinery factory every day lately. I think he recognized Guy Burns a long time ago. They must have met in the capital. Paul nodded. I see. No wonder he knows about Burns. Gerd looked back at the loom in the workshop, a loving expression on his face. My brother, he said, is a man of both interest and talent. He often says that if he hadn't been born into royalty, he would have been an excellent locksmith. This often makes him the target of ridicule from other nobles. After all, he was born into royalty, but he remains passionate about it. A hint of helplessness crossed Gerd's face. Paul smiled. Your brother is quite an interesting man, Paul said. I know an emperor who loved carpentry, so it's not too much of a stretch. Gerd smiled back, taking Paul's words as comfort, and didn't press for details about which historical figure this carpenter emperor was referring to. He continued, my brother's talent did come in handy. Do you know what a guillotine is, Paul? A guillotine? Our lords usually use hanging, but I know what a guillotine looks like, Gerd. In the capital, the guillotine blades used to be square, with a blade parallel to the platform. But this shape would chip after a few uses, and resharpening the blade was a hassle. Paul, let me guess, your brother, August, solved this problem. Yes, Gerd smiled again. Guess how he solved it? He changed the blade to triangle, with the blade angled, and from then on, it wasn't as prone to chipping. I see. That's a simple yet effective idea, Paul sincerely praised. The last name in the title is misspelled. Chapter 490 The lights of Jiaoan are going out. Just as Paul and Gerd were engaged in their lively conversation, a guard dressed as a lord's manner trotted into the factory and quickly approached Paul. He bowed to Paul and Gerd, my lords, then he looked at Paul. Paul asked, did you want to see me? What's the matter? The officials from the Council of State want to discuss something with you. The specific reason is in this letter. Because Gerd was present, the guard wasn't sure whether he should speak, so he simply handed the letter directly to Paul. Paul opened the letter, his eyes darting rapidly from side to side. His brows furrowed tightly at first, then relaxed. Gerd suppressed his curiosity and waited for him to finish reading the letter. Excuse my intrusion, but what has happened? If you may tell me. Paul handed him the letter directly. The war in Horn Bay has broken out, I see. Gerd took the letter and glanced through it. His face showed no surprise whatsoever. Anyone who knew even a little about the situation in Horn Bay wouldn't be surprised by the outbreak of war. It would be surprising if it hadn't broken out. Paul said, the initial news came by carrier pigeon. The war has probably been going on for over a week. He then asked, Does the kingdom's government have the power to protect the alder merchants in Horn Bay? Gerd shrugged with a wry smile. Given the current situation, it's a bit difficult, especially since Giles is between the Royal Territory and Horn Bay. Actually, this is the first time I've heard of using national power to protect merchants who have traveled abroad. Generally, shouldn't they be left to their fate? After all, they chose to pursue wealth, so they have to bear the corresponding risks. Alright, Paul didn't continue on this topic. Count Gleman, is the outbreak of the Horn Bay War troubling you? Gerd saw a hint of worry in Paul's eyes. Paul replied, Horn Bay is an important trading hub and rest stop for us. Instability there would pose a serious threat to our trade with the East. He apologized to Gerd. In that case, Your Excellency, I must immediately consult with my officials on countermeasures. I cannot accompany you on the rest of the tour. Gerd waved his hand. You need not worry about me. Please go about your business. He knew that the Northwest Bay had a vast maritime trade, so this matter was important to Paul. Paul nodded slightly to him and walked out of the workshop with his guards. The kingdoms of Horn Bay generally practiced a citizen-soldier system. Taking the Horn Bay Alliance as an example, the alliance had 10 main cities, including Nisburg. Each main city and its surrounding satellite towns constituted a large region, which was both an administrative and military unit. Each region was required to provide 1 unit of infantry and 1 unit of cavalry, as well as 5 ships with crew and weapons. This structure had remained largely unchanged for a long time. The entire Horn Bay Alliance's 10 districts, comprising land and sea forces, were commanded by 10 generals. During campaigns, the generals took turns commanding, with a chief general holding the highest rank. All freemen in the Horn Bay Alliance were citizen soldiers, divided into 4 ranks based on wealth. The first and second ranks provided cavalry, the third rank provided heavy infantry, and the fourth rank, or the proletariat, provided light infantry or oarsmen. Previously, citizen soldiers of each rank were required to provide their own weapons. This was the reason for the rank system based on wealth. However, this time, to completely eliminate the threat from the inland states, the alliance implemented certain military reforms, spending a large sum of money to purchase a large quantity of weapons and armor from the Northwest Bay. On the one hand, metal armor increased the number of heavy infantry. On the other hand, leather armor provided some protection for the previously largely unarmored light infantry. At this moment, Quiller Foster, wearing a finely crafted full suit of armor, stood on a high platform alongside other important military commanders of Horn Bay, below a dense crowd. As a nobleman's son, Quiller was certain to play a role in the war. The second son of the Foster family looked at the scene before him with a worried expression. A war mobilization rally was being held in Nice. Horace, the leader of the pro-war faction, was passionately and vehemently instilling in his audience the righteousness of his side in this war and the inevitability of victory. Citizens of the Alliance, my dear compatriots, the evil Horn Bay Church and its inland lackeys have assembled, and as I speak, their army has already crossed the border, invading our beautiful country. Answer me, should we stand idly by and watch this invasion? The crowd below was indignant. No, kill the Church's lackeys. The shouts were deafening. I see your passion for defending your homeland, Horace continued, satisfied with the people's reaction. The despicable and shameless Corner Bay Church has actually framed the Great Alliance with a premeditated murder. They truly deserve to call themselves servants of the Lord of Light. The Father will unleash his wrathful thunder to punish them. For a long time, the Corner Bay Church has been using the name of the Lord of Light to engage in the despicable act of bullying men and women. Citizens, fellow countrymen, ask yourselves, which of you hasn't had 1 or 2 relatives who were bullied by the Church's so-called witch hunts? But are they really conducting witch hunts? Oh, look, the records of wrongful convictions clearly states that they are merely using the guise of witch hunts to exploit the wealth of innocent people. The audience reacted fiercely, shouting, "To hell with the Church, to hell with Elvis." The curses were incessant. Everyone's painful memories of the witch hunts resurfaced. Because of the witch hunts, our trade has been disrupted. Because of the witch hunts, we live in constant fear. Because of the witch hunts, we even have to be careful what we say. Yet we had already endured all of this, naively believing that the Church was truly considering the common people's interests. But when that damn Church threatened to hand over our hard-earned money to those lazy, ungrateful bastards in the interior, we realized we had been fooled, and reality slapped us hard in the face. So, the heroic people of the Alliance gave a heroic response, expelling the Church's lackeys from the Alliance's territory, no longer recognizing them as the Father's representatives on earth. and bravely facing the church's enraged threats of war. Now, they have put their threats into practice with their despicable pretexts. But we want to tell them that the Great Alliance is even more willing to protect its people. We swear to fight to the end. Horus's rapid-fire words ignited the emotions of the audience. Fight to the end, fight to the end, the resounding slogans echoed throughout Nijmsburg. Unlike the fervor in the square, the speaker's office was silent. Joe Foster and his friend, Speaker Marcus, stood by the window, watching the dispersing crowd after the mobilization rally. My friend, do you think we will win this war? Unlike his confidence in front of others, Marcus asked his friend with trepidation. Foster slowly replied, whether we win the war or not. He pointed out the window. It was nearing night, and lights were beginning to illuminate homes in Nijmsburg. A blazing fire had been lit atop the lighthouse on the dock. The dense lights had always been Nijmsburg's pride, a testament to the residents' wealth. But Foster said, the lights of the entire Horn Bay are going out, and we may never see them relit in our lifetime. Chapter 491 War 1. They're attacking. They're attacking. A merchant-looking fellow rushed into the tavern in a panic. He was a very portly man, struggling to move his large belly, panting heavily, yet he didn't slow his pace at all, not even caring that his wig was about to fall off. With a thud, the merchant collided head-on with a waiter carrying the wine, both falling backward onto the floor. Lister, who was drinking, put down his cup and looked at the disheveled merchant. Under his gaze, the merchant hurriedly got up from the floor, ignoring his soiled clothes, and shouted hysterically. Run! Run quickly! The Collins cavalry is coming. What nonsense are you talking about? Yub is a neutral city-state, someone shouted back, but there was a clear hint of fear in their voice. The merchant retorted without hesitation, neutral? Neutral my foot. You can only be neutral if someone tells you to. What good is it if you just shout neutral yourself? The inland cavalry are already only miles away from this city. Go out the east gate and see for yourself. I'm not going to waste my breath on you. He scurried up the stairs. The tavern also served as lodging, presumably to pack his belongings. The other patrons, who were drinking, exchanged bewildered glances. Lister felt a chill. Could he really be that unlucky? Because of the tensions within the Horn Bay Alliance, he had left Nijmsburg early to avoid being drawn into the war. On the outskirts of Horn Bay, there were some small city-states that remained neutral, neither opposing the church nor condemning the apostasy of the coastal states. This provided a safe haven for some merchants unwilling to leave Horn Bay. Many believed the war wouldn't last long. After one or two large battles, with one side's defeat, surrender, reparations, or territorial concessions, Horn Bay would quickly return to peace, and they could happily make money again. Jeb was one such city-state that declared itself neutral. But today, church cavalry had actually approached this city that didn't want to get involved in the war. Merchants chattered amongst themselves. The Lord of Yubu should come forward to negotiate, right? A friend just told me he saw the Lord's caravan going hunting at the south gate. Lister no longer hesitated. He decided to leave the city immediately. He checked his money pouch, figuring it would last him a while, and decided not to go back to his lodgings to pack. Running out of the tavern, Lister headed straight for a nearby carriage shop. The horse he'd ridden to Yubu had fallen ill. Entering the shop, his tense heart relaxed somewhat. Thankfully, there weren't many people there yet. It seemed not many had heard the news. He spotted a mid-range carriage with two fine horses. The carriage wasn't large, but it could seat 2 or 3 people. He asked the coachman, how much to Praia, the neighboring town? The coachman held up 3 fingers. 3 silver coins, sir. List readily pulled out 3 silver coins and slapped them into the coachman's hand. Can we depart now? Yes, sir. Just as List was about to get into the carriage, a large crowd surged into the carriage shop. How much to Praia? How much to Songson? How much for your horse? The people who rushed in were all there to rent carriages or buy horses. The coachman immediately understood what was going on. He grabbed List's collar as he was about to board the carriage. Sir, it's 10 silver coins now. List's face turned ashen. How can you be so dishonest? The coachman chuckled. The me before wasn't the me now. List didn't want to argue philosophically with him. He looked around the carriage shop. What to do? Find someone else? But almost all the coaches were negotiating prices with others. All right, 10 it is. List gritted his teeth and agreed to the coachman's price increase. Guest, please get in and settle in. We'll be departing shortly. Lister climbed into the carriage, and the driver flicked the reins, propelling the 2 horses forward. As they waited outside the carriage post, Lister noticed something was amiss. "Wait, isn't this the gate to Priya, master?" the driver shouted. "My home is in Yeb, and I have a wife and children there. I want to take them with me to Priya." Lister felt a surge of despair, regretting not having asked someone else when he entered the carriage post. By the time the driver arrived home and picked up his wife and children, news of the cavalry outside the city had spread throughout the city. The streets were a chaotic mess, people rushing to escape, scrambling to buy food, and searching for loved ones. Traffic was in complete disarray, severely hindering the carriage's progress. More than an hour later, Lister and his party finally emerged from the walls of Yeb. "Could you go any faster?" Lister, almost in tears, anxiously urged the driver, who had just whipped the horse. "Sir, this is the fastest we can go. There are 4 of us in this carriage," the driver could only reply. Helpless, Lister could only repeatedly draw his holy emblem on his chest, praying for a safe journey and that they wouldn't encounter any mutinous soldiers. Unfortunately, what he feared most came to pass. They hadn't traveled 3 miles when they encountered 2 armies on the plain ahead. One army flew the banners of Yeb, while Lister didn't recognize the banners of the other army. It shouldn't be Collins's, but it was most likely an allied force. Other refugees on the road immediately turned and scattered. Lister and the driver discussed it and decided to hide in a nearby grove. Following the others would be too conspicuous. Who knew if there were other armies nearby? After reaching the grove, they parked the carriage. The higher ground offered a clear view of their surroundings. Lister and the driver quietly hid in the bushes at the edge of the grove, observing the 2 armies that had already arrayed themselves in the distance. Both sides' soldiers seemed to be shouting at each other, gesturing wildly and making contemptuous gestures. But the knights on tall horses, clad in armor, remained motionless, staring at each other. Lister noticed that there were many unridden horses near the unidentified army, suggesting that the main force was not cavalry, but rather mounted infantry. Accompanied by the rising and falling horns and waving banners, both sides gradually quieted down, and then, under the command of the knights who seemed to be commanders, slowly approached each other. The infantrymen were mostly armed with lances. Those in the front held their lances straight forward, while those in the back extended their lances through the gaps in the front ranks or rested them on the shoulders of those in front. From a distance, the 2 lance formations looked like 2 porcupines approaching each other back to back. Please vote. Chapter 492 War 2. 2 porcupines, back to back, approached each other, their quills finally meeting, then stabbing at each other. The first rank was the unluckiest. Those unfortunate soldiers, unable to dodge in time, were pierced in the chest, throat, shoulder, or leg by the spear tips. Almost simultaneously, wounded men on both sides cried out in pain, or simply collapsed to the ground without a sound. Upon the casualties, the first 2 ranks of soldiers instinctively stopped or retreated, twisting their bodies from side to side as the opposing spear tips swung, trying to avoid being stabbed. The 2 opposing formations almost immediately ceased their advance, with only the first few ranks of soldiers gesturing with their spears towards each other's faces while dodging the equally erratic spear tips. The spears on both sides clashed and parried against each other in the gap between them. Commanders on both sides repeatedly gave orders, urging their men forward with shouts and whips, attempting to make them risk injury and death to plunge their spears into the bodies of their enemies. But each command only allowed their troops to advance a little, and after casualties, the soldiers would spontaneously retreat. Contact, disengagement, contact, disengagement. The 2 armies repeated this process endlessly, making Lister increasingly anxious. At this moment, billowing dust appeared on the main road leading east. Lister looked up and was startled to see a cavalry force rapidly approaching. This cavalry was clearly a level above the 2 infantry forces currently engaged. Every soldier was clad in armor and carried a lance. Some in the Ibu army spotted the cavalry rapidly approaching from their flank and rear, and almost instantly, their formation began to crumble. Some turned their lances towards the charging cavalry, some planted their lances on the ground, bewildered and helpless. The unluckiest were the first few ranks engaged in bayonet fighting. Many were stabbed in the distraction. As the cavalry rapidly approached, they gradually formed a wedge formation. When they were about 40 or 50 meters from the Ibu army, all the horses suddenly accelerated, crashing into the Ibu army at an incredible speed. As the lead cavalryman's horse was about to collide with the enemy's lance, it neighed and reared up, managing to stop itself at the last moment. But this didn't prevent its rider from thrusting his lance with precision and power. This cavalryman was so well trained, it was as if he and his horse were born of the same body. The Yibu soldier in front of him watched in horror as the lance pierced his chest, collapsing helplessly with resentment and lingering fear. The cavalryman, having landed a successful blow, withdrew his weapon and immediately turned his horse and galloped away. His companions, following closely behind, repeated his actions. In fact, his companions had only been engaged with the Yibu soldier a few breaths later, because the final charge had been too swift. Not all cavalrymen were as lucky as the lead cavalryman. Some missed their targets, others couldn't find suitable targets, but none stopped to linger. Every single one immediately turned their horses and disengaged from the Yibu soldiers. The first cavalry charge caused few casualties, and those who fell were immediately replaced by those behind. However, the Yibu army's phalanx was beginning to crumble. The timid soldiers remained obediently in their positions, while some bolder or eager to achieve soldiers ran out of the phalanx with their weapons drawn as the cavalry began to retreat, hoping to gain an advantage with their lances before the enemy horses could accelerate. But their hopes were dashed, and the commander shouted for these fools to return to their positions. The cavalry, having distanced themselves from the phalanx, quickly adjusted their formation and repeated the previous tactics, once again sweeping towards the Yibu army's phalanx like a whirlwind. But this whirlwind carried deadly blades, each sweep causing casualties among the Yibu soldiers. The Yibu army's phalanx grew increasingly loose under the relentless, whirlwind-like cavalry attacks. Instinctively, fear made the soldiers subconsciously want to stay away from densely populated areas, as these areas were often the cavalry's primary targets. Finally, only a few ranks of soldiers who had been facing off against the enemy pikemen remained, barely maintaining their formation. These ranks were clearly better protected and more disciplined than the others. Lister, witnessing cavalry warfare for the first time, gritted his teeth, his heart filled with fear. He imagined himself in the Yibu phalanx, facing the swiftly advancing enemy cavalry, and how he would react. "Yibu is finished," a sorrowful sigh, tinged with sobs, rang out beside him. It was the coachman. At his direction, Lister looked in the direction he had come from, and saw plumes of black smoke rising from the distant city of Yibu. It seemed the fighting wasn't limited to this area. Had the city already been breached? "Sir, be thankful we escaped in time," he said, unsure how to comfort the coachman who had lost his homeland. Lister refocused his attention on the nearby battle, where the church army's cavalry was charging once more. This seemed to be the final charge. The cavalrymen didn't rein in their galloping horses, letting them plunge into the ranks of the Yibu soldiers. The dense forest of spears had vanished, leaving ample gaps for easy evasion. Their spears, after striking an enemy, were immediately discarded, replaced by single-handed swords used to indiscriminately slash at the Yibu soldiers around them. Along with a few relatively disciplined ranks at the front, the Yibu army was quickly thrown into chaos and collapsed. Many dropped their weapons and fled, trying to escape the battlefield. But these were often quickly overtaken by the cavalry and killed with a single sword stroke. Those remaining on the battlefield, with no hope of victory, also dropped their weapons, placed their hands behind their heads, and crouched or knelt on the ground, awaiting the enemy's fate. "Sigh," Lister sighed softly. He said to the coachman, "Let's hide here for a while, and go out after they've left." Just then, a woman's scream rang out behind them. The two were startled. It was the coachman's wife. The coachman, like a madman, rushed towards the spot where they had hidden the carriage. Lister hesitated for a moment, then followed. A heart-pounding scene unfolded before him. 3 soldiers wielding long swords surrounded the carriage, while the coachman's wife and children clung to each other, weeping bitterly. "My lords," the coachman cried, kneeling down with a thud. Tears streaming down his face, he pleaded, We are just ordinary people. Please, my lords, let us go." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 493 War 3. Hearing the coachman's pleas, the 3 soldiers wielding long swords showed no expression. They merely exchanged glances, and the oldest of them stepped forward towards the kneeling coachman and Lister standing beside him. This man was tall and robust, clad in chainmail, with a thick beard, deep-set eyes, and piercing gaze. He looked like a powerful warrior. As he approached the coachman and Lister, he slowly said, Gentlemen, please don't be alarmed. We three just happened to be passing by, but Lister instinctively sensed that the man's entire body was tense, as if preparing for an attack, giving him the feeling of a leopard poised to pounce on its prey. Just as the situation seemed to be turning against him, Lister acted decisively, raising his voice and risking being discovered by the forest's outer church army, shouting, "I am the special envoy of Lord Paul Gleman, Lord of Aldo, Lord Count." These two words immediately stunned the bearded man who was about to make a move, in Lister's perception. He seemed to hesitate, and a companion, seeing his hesitation, said fiercely, "Raja, anyway, nobody knows we passed through here." The companion glanced at Lister. "Except for these few people." "Shut up, you idiot." The bearded man named Raja glared fiercely at his companion. These guys had never experienced the pain of being retaliated against by nobles. What if this man was some kind of confidant? Lister's heart pounded. From their conversation, he was almost certain that the bearded man had intended to kill him and the coachman. He tried to calm his heart and maintain a composed expression. He even began to admire his own strong will. "I was ordered by Count Gleman to go to Yeb to negotiate a business deal for his family, but I encountered a mutinous army on my way out." He unhurriedly pulled a roll of parchment from his pocket and said, "This is my voucher. If you don't believe me, you can look at what's on it." He then handed the parchment to the bearded warrior. It was indeed an identity document, a contraption Paul had created, modeled after a passport from his previous life. It requested the local ruler to grant convenience to merchants from the Northwest Bay, and it even bore the coat of arms of the Gleman family. Of course, this world didn't yet have the international system of his previous life. Its primary function was to prove the holder's origin from the Northwest Bay. Whether the local ruler was willing to grant Paul face depended entirely on his mood. Lister was gambling on whether the bearded warrior and his companion were literate, and whether they could impress them with a noble coat of arms. Actually, he didn't hold out much hope. The bearded warrior's companion hadn't seemed afraid to kill a noble's envoy, unbeknownst to others. If it weren't for a sliver of hope sustaining him, Lister would have collapsed to the ground long ago. The decorations around this coat of arms are indeed in the style of the Aldo nobles. He really is an envoy. The bearded warrior, well informed, recognized the noble coat of arms, but Lister's gamble paid off. He couldn't read and didn't decipher the contents of the parchment. Too simple. Lister thought to himself. "I've heard of Paul Gleman," said the bearded warrior. "Oh? You've heard of my lord?" "Yes, 2 years ago, I was an adventurer making a living in Niceburg. I heard from my fellow adventurers that it was Count Gleman's warriors who rescued the Archduke of Eaton's sister-in-law from the wolf plague." "Ah, is that so?" Lister had never heard of this before. "May I ask your name?" "Friedrich Lister. You can just call me Lister." "All right, Lord Lister. We just happened to be passing through. As you can see, The bearded warrior's previously tense body relaxed, but he began to stammer. "All right, I know who you are now. Rest assured, I won't lie. I swear to my Lord and my Heavenly Father." Lister raised his right hand solemnly. Actually, judging from their attire, these three were likely deserters from Yeb. The bearded warrior's face flushed slightly. "I'm sorry you had to see this, sir, but we just didn't want to become prisoners and then slaves in a battle we were destined to lose." His face then turned resentful. The Lord of Yebu, that coward, when he learned that the church's army was outside the city, he actually ran away under the lame excuse of hunting, abandoning the entire city's people and the army that was still loyal to him. When I heard this news, I felt that the oath I had sworn before had been trampled on and was worthless, so I took 2 other brothers and left. After saying this, the warrior named Raja spat angrily on the ground. "Oh, I understand how you felt at the time. Of course, in my opinion, your actions were completely moral. After all, that so-called lord broke the contract first." What else could Lister say but stroke the other's hair? Just as he was about to ask himself, the coachman, and his wife when they could leave, the warrior named Raja suddenly asked, "Sir, where are your guards?" "Guards? What guards do I have?" Lister's face immediately turned sorrowful, showing not a trace of surprise or panic. "They tried to protect me, Alice. Not everyone is as reasonable as Mr. Raja. I must go back and tell the Earl, and ask him to avenge me." His sorrowful expression quickly transformed into a fierce one. Then, Raja made a suggestion that greatly surprised Lister. "If you lack guards, you can hire the 3 of us to provide you with security." In the autumn of Holy Calendar 1995, the war in Horn Bay finally broke out. The Horn Bay Church, citing blasphemy and assassination of high-ranking officials of the papacy, labeled the coastal nations as heretics, organized a pacifist army led by the inland nation of Collins, and declared its intention to attack the coastal nations, vowing to bring their faith back to the right path. The coastal nations countered sharply, publicly declaring that only the emerging Protestant denomination could represent a Lord of Light, and organized a Protestant army led by the Hornby Alliance to confront the Hornby Church's pacifist army. Having foreseen the inevitability of war, the well-prepared Hornby Alliance, within a month of the assassination, organized a powerful army of 15,000 well-equipped men to garrison the border, guarding against an invasion by the Church's army. They planned to join forces with the coastal allies and continue their advance into Church territory, heading straight for Collins. However, no one anticipated that the Protestant army would launch a surprise attack, brazenly invading several neutral small states in northern Hornby. Through these states, they extended their reach into the previously unconnected northern coastal countries, which were also Protestant territory. These northern coastal countries, not being near the Protestant army, had made little preparation for the war, and some of their troops had already set out to join the Hornby Alliance forces. Faced with the Protestant army's passage attack, they were immediately in a precarious situation. The war in Hornby became unpredictable from the very beginning. Chapter 494 Security Issues of Overseas Assets. Inside the Lord's Manor in Lakeside Town, high-ranking officials from the government and the military were gathered. The atmosphere was heavy, everyone was contemplating the battle at Hornby. Old Ford, eyes closed, tapped the table lightly with his right hand. Cecil and Hansel stared blankly at their teacups. Schroeder puffed on his pipe, watching the rising smoke rings thoughtfully. Bryce's brow furrowed, he seemed to want to say something but couldn't speak. Laddie wore a worried expression, presumably concerned about the future of her homeland. Paul glanced to his left, then to his right. Gentlemen, sitting here like this won't do. Does anyone have any good strategies to mitigate the risks? Undoubtedly, the outbreak of war would threaten trade in the Northwest Bay. Strategies? Hearing Paul's question, Hansel was speechless. In fact, because of Hornby's crucial role as a transshipment point for east-west trade, the intelligence department had been closely monitoring the area. Every official in Lakeside Town was well aware of the tense situation in Hornby. The sheer number of weapons procured by the Hornby Alliance was enough to give a glimpse. Whether the river water was cold or warm was best known to the ducks that swam in it daily. Half a year ago, merchants from the Northwest Bay, who had significant business dealings with Hornby, jointly petitioned the Lord's Court, requesting that the Lord purchase or lease a small piece of land in Hornby. This land could serve as a base for Northwest Bay merchants should war break out, allowing them to maintain their function as a supply point on the route to the east. However, the Earl at the time refused, citing excessive costs. 3 months ago, the Council of State revisited the merchants' petition for discussion. Everyone agreed that now was not the time to be stingy, the chemical plant should be shut down, and the reservoir and school construction should be halted. The priority should be to buy land in Hornby, preferably an island. Earl Gleman was displeased, declaring that no one should divert funds from the established projects. Now, with fighting finally imminent in Hornby, the Earl was seeking everyone's opinions. But no one mentioned buying land anymore. Ahem, Ford felt the silence would embarrass Paul, so he broke it, saying, "Our trade activities are mainly concentrated along the coast, and the Corner Bay Church's forces can't reach the coast so quickly, so there's still some buffer time. But there's one thing, money and people can be easily evacuated, but some real estate there, including private enterprises and those of the state council, is difficult to take away. And after the war breaks out, some unscrupulous individuals will inevitably take advantage of the chaos, so," he raised an eyebrow slightly, seemingly glancing casually at Chief of Staff Schroeder. "We'd better have an armed force in Corner Bay capable of deterring those with ill intentions, huh?" Hearing the State Council's Chief of Staff mention armed forces, Schroeder, who was puffing on his cigarette, paused. To be honest, Schroeder had thought that as Chief of Staff, he was just there to listen in, because how could Corner Bay, so far away, possibly have any connection with the Alda Army, which currently only reigns supreme in the Northwest Bay? Arda's only military force capable of projecting to Cape Bay is its navy, but those landlocked countries don't even have a small boat. What would be the point of sending warships? Just to stand by and watch? That is indeed a problem, Schroeder. Paul looked at him. Could we send an army to Cape Bay? Perhaps, a battalion, ahem. Lord Gleman, Schroeder placed his beloved pipe on the table and stood up. I'm sorry, our forces do not yet have that capability. He first poured cold water on Paul's idea, then began listing the reasons one by one. First, while sending 1 or 2 battalions is easy, our army is heavily reliant on gunpowder, firearms, and artillery, equipment we possess uniquely. These items can currently only be produced in the Northwest Bay, and they are consumables. Resupplying them in Cape Bay, thousands of miles away, is a serious problem. Second, even assuming our army has sufficient transport capacity to deliver these supplies to Cape Bay in time, we lack or rather, a series of stable bases there, to store, transfer, and distribute our supplies. Finally, we are unfamiliar with the climate and environment there. Our soldiers are all from the Northwest Bay, and most have never left their hometowns. A sudden trip to the hot and humid Cape Bay could easily lead to acclimatization problems, gentlemen, Schroeder emphasized, glancing around at the crowd before solemnly stating, don't underestimate this last reason. Acclimatization issues can be fatal, and there's a risk of terrible contagion. Some diseases may have mild symptoms for the locals, but for outsiders, they are deadly sights, something far more terrifying than any tangible enemy. A look of reminiscence crossed his eyes. 30 years ago, I had just joined the Watchers Legion. The Watchers Legion was stationed in the Narratan Corridor in the Northwest Bay, both in the north of the kingdom. But when I first arrived, I had diarrhea for a whole week. Back then, I was a strong young man. In conclusion, Schroeder looked at Paul and concluded, I strongly oppose sending troops to Horn Bay now. It's sending soldiers to their deaths. However, he changed the subject. If your excellency is interested, we can begin preparations now. We can send intelligence personnel to survey the terrain, collect information on various vegetation and animals, send doctors to learn about local diseases and herbs, and send envoys to negotiate with the rulers there, to see if we can acquire a piece of land as a foothold. If we do these things now, I estimate that in 6 months we will have the initial capability to project power into Horn Bay. Paul remained silent, and the meeting room fell silent. At this moment, Hansel stood up timidly and said cautiously, Lord Gleman, if an older army appears in a war in which the kingdom is not involved, His Majesty the King will be in a difficult position. All right, Paul looked troubled. You all have a point. We can't send our men to their deaths, nor can we put His Majesty in a difficult position. Lord Gleman, Schroeder spoke again. As the chief of staff and the most important person advising Paul on military matters, he still actively racked his brains, trying to provide solutions as much as possible. If it's just about deterring outlaws, why don't you try mercenaries? Chapter 495 Mercenaries. Heave-ho, Doug swung his shovel with all his might, loading a shovelful of coal into the bed of the coal truck next to him. This burly man in his 30s looked vastly different from his former self as a mercenary captain. When Doug was the captain of a mercenary group, he had shoulder-length hair, and although his face was unshaven, he possessed a rugged charm. His brown eyes always gleamed with a sharp light, and those who met his gaze for the first time often associated him with birds of prey like eagles. Years of adventure and combat had made him so confident, even arrogant, stubbornly believing that good fortune was always with him. But now, Doug's once unruly long hair was gone, replaced by a plain buzz cut. His beard was clean-shaven, and the sharp, eagle-like light in his eyes was gone. Instead, he gave off the dull, numb feeling of an old farmer who had spent his whole life farming, a feeling of hopelessness, of living his life like this forever. Before Doug, or rather around him, lay piles of coal, each as large as a small mountain. His daily task was to load these mined coals onto wagons. No powerful martial arts skills or fancy moves were needed. His daily routine consisted of nothing but swinging the shovel over and over again. These coal mountains seemed endless. Each time a pile was loaded, more coal would be hauled out of the mine and piled into a new mountain. These dark coal mountains seemed even taller and more majestic than the distant Rocky Mountains, offering Doug no hope of ever crossing them. It was like a giant cage, trapping him there until he exhausted the rest of his life. His glorious past could only be relived in his dreams, where he was still the mercenary leader, drinking and eating heartily, until the sounds of gunfire and artillery roused him. Sometimes he would secretly imagine what his life would have been like a few years ago. If he hadn't accepted the employment of that Aldo nobleman named Emerson, he wouldn't have ended up as a prisoner in the Northwest Bay. But what was the use of such assumptions? Who could have imagined that the Northwest Bay possessed such powerful weapons and such a powerful army? Mercenaries, Paul asked his chief of staff with a puzzled look. Schroeder offered Paul a suggestion that surprised him greatly. Yes, mercenaries, Schroeder nodded, and mercenary groups from Horn Bay. He raised his right hand slightly. The locals. Horn Bay is their home, they know everything about it, the climate and geography are things they've been adapted to since childhood, and they know what they can and cannot eat in the wild. Most importantly, the elderly knight smiled and said, we don't have to bear too many obligations to mercenaries, which can save a lot of allowances and pensions. That's a good idea. Schroeder's suggestion made Paul realize something. He said, you mean we'll spend some money to hire a mercenary group in Horn Bay, tell them the mission, and let them handle the logistics and supplies themselves? Schroeder nodded again. That's basically it, Lord Gleman. Good. Paul was delighted. I'll send someone to Horn Bay to find suitable mercenaries right away. Wait, Lord Gleman. Schroeder stopped him. Huh? Why, actually, you don't need to go through the trouble of finding a mercenary group yourself. There's one, Schroeder said with a smile, or rather, two groups, the Horn Bay mercenaries, right here in our Northwest Bay. Paul frowned and asked, was it hired by some lord? Or are they doing something bad? If it's the latter, then I'll have to send someone to eliminate them. No, Schroeder shook his head, they're not doing anything bad right now. In fact, they've already been eliminated by you. These mercenaries are all in the labor camps you created. Huh? Paul was confused. Seeing that Paul didn't remember, Schroeder had to enlighten him. Lord Gleman, do you remember the War of the Usurpers? Of course, it had only ended a few years ago. In that war, we encountered two mercenary groups, hired by Malskent from the south to fight us. Paul suddenly realized, slapping the table, I remember now, Schroeder. One mercenary group's members were skilled with longbows, while the other's members were more balanced. Paul, yes, that's right. They were all taken prisoner and are now scattered and imprisoned in different places for labor reform, Schroeder suggested. According to our interrogation, most of them came from Horn Bay. Perhaps you could consider using this group to regroup them, rearm them with our equipment, I mean, melee weapons like swords and shields, and send them to Horn Bay to fight for our interests, to atone for the crimes they committed against us in the War of the Usurpers. Paul nodded inwardly. Schroeder's suggestion truly struck a chord with him. These captured mercenaries were highly experienced in combat and familiar with the local area. Where else could one find such readily available resources? However, a problem immediately occurred to him. Schroeder, what if they become uncontrollable once they reach Horn Bay? Do we have to send troops there to capture them again? The chief of staff exhaled a smoke ring with satisfaction, squinting his eyes, and said, don't worry about their loyalty, there's a very good way to solve it. Paul, what way? Schroeder, turn them into your slaves. Paul was a little confused, but they are already my slaves in effect. Schroeder, haha, Lord Gleman, I mean the Horn Bay method, brand them with your unique mark. Paul, brand. At this moment, Laddie, who had been silent until now, interjected, Lord Gleman, in Horn Bay, if a branded slave dares to betray his master, he will be arrested by whoever sees him and sent back to his master. Whatever punishment the master may give him is his right. After listening, Schroeder nodded and said to Paul, that's right, just as advisor Sersha said. These people were captured by you in the war. According to the customs of Horn Bay, they are your slaves in both sentiment and reason. As long as the other people in Horn Bay know about their relationship with you, these mercenaries will never be able to turn their lives around. Chapter 496 Mercenaries 2. A long, loud whistle rang out, seemingly enlivening the atmosphere of the entire coal mine, signaling the end of the day's work. The workers, or rather, the prisoners, stopped their work, stretching and turning their bodies. After relaxing their muscles, which had been tense all day, the prisoners gathered in twos and threes at a stream in the mining area to wash. They took off their clothes, leaving themselves bare-chested and naked. After all, the camp was full of men. They first thoroughly washed the towels they had used to wipe away sweat in the water, then soaked the towels again and used them to scrub away the grime from their bodies. Doug was also washing himself. When he stopped shoveling coal, he was covered in black coal dust, so he had gone back to his dormitory to get a clean change of clothes. While washing himself, he also washed the dusty clothes. After washing and changing into clean clothes, Doug felt a wave of relief. Most of the fatigue from the day's work had disappeared. Boss Doug, a low voice called from behind, and a guy with a buzz cut but shifty eyes suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Doug looked around. No one was looking his way. Then he grabbed the guy and pulled him to a secluded corner. "Patton, you damn bastard, I've been waiting for you. How did things go?" "We got them back." The guy pulled a small ceramic bottle from his pocket and carefully handed it to Doug. Doug took it, held the bottle to his ear, and gently shook it. A bubbling sound came from inside. "That's all? We've hoarded so much coal," Doug said discontentedly. Patton said dejectedly, "Boss Doug, it's not my fault. The new guy is too greedy. His heart is blacker than the blackest coal I've ever seen. He's doubled the price." Doug's brows furrowed deeply, the wrinkles forming like mountain ranges. He muttered bitterly, "Despicable Austrian, cunning Austrian. Oh well, what can we do? We're just fish on the chopping block." He picked up the small earthenware bottle, his eyes fixed on it. It was just an ordinary, earthen yellow bottle, tightly sealed with a cork. Yet, in Doug's eyes, it seemed to contain some kind of magic potion. "Oh, I'm counting on you for the next week." With that, he yanked off the cork, brought the bottle to his nose, and took a deep breath. The tantalizing aroma of alcohol made Doug feel incredibly comfortable, and his mouth watered. He slightly opened his mouth, gently pressed the bottle's opening to his lower lip, and then slowly lifted the bottle. The life-saving nectar inside flowed into Doug's mouth like a stream, instantly filling his entire oral cavity with that long-lost taste. Doug didn't swallow immediately, but instead rinsed his mouth repeatedly with his first sip, letting the liquid soak into every corner. After a full minute, he gently moved his throat, reluctantly and carefully sending this first sip down his esophagus. "Tisk tisk, nectar," Doug smacked his lips, exclaiming with a look of intoxication. Patton, watching his boss drink, could only sniffle, trying his best to catch the aroma in the air, swallowing his saliva mouthful after mouthful. Glug, Doug tasted the second sip, this time not lingering in his mouth for long, but swallowing it cleanly. The third sip, the fourth sip. After taking a full 10 small sips, Doug put down the bottle. He was now radiant, full of energy, and his eyes had sharpened again, as if the mercenary captain he once was had returned. "Here," Doug shoved the bottle into Patton's hand. Patton tapped it with his finger. "Haha, a third of it was left." "Thanks, boss." "Thanks, boss." He nodded and bowed repeatedly, thanking Doug profusely. "Hurry up, don't let the guards find out." "Okay, I'll take care of it." Patton raised the bottle, mimicking Doug, taking a small sip to savor it, then downing the rest in one gulp. Finally, he pulled out a water pouch, poured some water into the bottle, gently swirled it, and then drank the rest in one go. Sigh. "Those Aldo guys are watching us too closely. When will this end?" "That Gleman guy has no aristocratic manners at all." Both of them perked up, and had the energy to curse the Aldo guys again. Since their capture during the War of the Usurpers, they had been imprisoned in this dreadful place called the labor camp, spending their days surrounded by black coal. At first, Doug and the others thought they would either be tortured to death or work themselves to death, but to their surprise, they fared quite well, in contrast to their initial pessimism. They were given 2 meals a day, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. The morning meal consisted mainly of brick bread made from barley or rye, eaten with pickled vegetables. It was a bit tough, and occasionally they could taste sawdust, but it was filling. The afternoon meal consisted of 2 slices of bread and unlimited vegetable porridge, a thick, mushy porridge mixed with vegetables. A few days each month, the porridge would be mixed with scraps of meat or eggs. They could also secretly collect some coal scraps and, when the guards weren't looking, trade them for some alcohol with the villagers outside the walls. However, they were far from free. This so-called freedom wasn't the unbridled freedom they had before their capture. The lack of freedom stemmed from the fact that the Ordas were overly controlling. The Ordas imposed extremely strict housekeeping regulations on them. For example, first, the prisoners' quarters were required to be kept spotless, with guards conducting unannounced raids daily. Second, prisoners were required to maintain a presentable appearance. Unkemptness and other undesirable traits were absolutely forbidden. Any violation of the regulations resulted in a beating, or worse, being thrown into solitary confinement and starved. Doug, a mercenary for over a decade, was utterly bewildered. Was the Ordas managing prisoners or an army? Even if they were training an army, maintaining hygiene and personal appearance was something only royal guards or similar units were bound by. Having spent so many years battling on the battlefield, he knew all too well what ordinary armies were like. Slovenly living habits and lice infestations were the norm for ordinary soldiers. As for prisoners elsewhere, well, Describing their quarters as latrines was an understatement. Doug and Patton walked back to their dorm, cursing Obama's perverted ways while secretly feeling a strange sense of relief. Chapter 497 Mercenaries 3. Beep beep beep. The loud sound of the trumpet echoed throughout the camp, signaling that it was mealtime. Doug and Patton, carrying their wooden lunch boxes, lined up in front of the kitchen. More than 30 people were already ahead of them. "Hey, Boss Doug," "Hey, Patton," people greeted them as they arrived. The mercenaries hadn't been dispersed or resettled, they'd all been dumped into this labor camp right next to the coal mine. The locals didn't care if they maintained the old order from their mercenary days, or if they still obeyed their mercenary leader. All they needed was for them to complete their assigned tasks on time and in full. Back in Horn Bay, mercenaries, especially those with combat experience, were a valuable resource. After being captured, they were often incorporated into the army that captured them. These guys weren't knights, loyalty was irrelevant to them. They'd follow whoever offered the best treatment or promised to restore their freedom after being captured. However, this didn't apply to the Northwest Bay. The lord who captured them had no intention of incorporating them into his ranks, he simply used them as tools. Initially, some tried to cause trouble, but the ringleader, whom Doug and Ferguson, the leader of another mercenary group, had secretly instigated, was bound and executed on the spot with a 12-pound cannon by the Ordos. The shocking scene terrified the mercenaries, and they quickly quieted down. They finally understood that the Ordos truly didn't care what they thought, they simply treated them as a group of self-moving tools, to be discarded whenever one malfunctioned. Their initial illusions were shattered by the harsh reality, and the mercenaries from Horn Bay quickly accepted themselves as slaves of the Ordos. Their rapid shift in mindset was related to the Horn Bay culture they were familiar with from childhood. Horn Bay had a tradition of using prisoners of war as slaves. Well, as long as they maintained the right attitude, life in this labor camp was quite comfortable. After getting his own food, Doug joined the group of people having a feast with Patton. He first dipped his bread into the thick soup, otherwise he'd break his teeth, and when he thought it was ready, he put it in his mouth and chewed hard. The soup had a bit of meat flavor today, not bad. "Hey guys. Where's Ferguson and his men today?" He looked around at the customers, chewing his bread as he asked. Ferguson was the leader of another mercenary group, they'd been hired together and captured together. "Just now, while we were still in line, before you and Patton arrived, I saw this group being gathered up and taken away by the guards," a young man, probably only 16 or 17, replied. Doug felt a pang of regret seeing this young man answer him. His life had just begun, and now it was going to end in this godforsaken place. "I saw it too, yes. The guards came to find Ferguson themselves and let him lead his group away." Many people had provided Doug with information. What happened? Doug was bewildered. Ferguson and his men had been taken away by the Aldo? Were they taken to execution? Or released? If the former, would he and his men be next? If the latter, why? Why? Doug stared blankly at his bread, oblivious to the people calling him Boss Doug. Boss Doug. Patton tugged at Doug's sleeve, shaking him repeatedly. "Huh? What is it?" Doug snapped out of his reverie. "The guards are calling us." What? Was it his turn? Doug's heart trembled as the unknown fate descended upon him. "Everyone," the guards shouted through a megaphone, "assemble immediately in the open area outside." Within 15 minutes, almost reflexively, everyone jumped up and ran outside, abandoning their unfinished meals. The prisoners were subjected to a degree of military training, similar to that of the Alda army, including drills, housekeeping, and morning and evening runs, primarily for ease of management. After assembling, a man in an Alda uniform walked over, pacing back and forth in front of the prisoners several times, carefully observing them. Finally, he nodded in satisfaction and asked in a booming voice, "Which one is Ribeiro, Doug?" "Step forward." Doug hesitated, but knew he couldn't avoid it. So he shouted, "Here." Following his usual running drill, he clenched his fists at his sides, raised them to above his waist, jogged out of formation, and stood before the oldest soldier. Reporting. "Ribeiro Doug, number 2001, reporting for duty." The soldier looked him up and down, making Doug feel as if he were in a livestock market, a horse to be bought, and the soldier the buyer. "Follow me. The rest of you, stand like that for an hour." The buyer seemed to have his eye on him, pulling on the reins. The rest were bewildered, not even daring to look at each other, wondering if some bastard had done something wrong and everyone was being punished by standing like this. Doug followed nervously until they entered the labor camp's management office. Ferguson, Doug was a little surprised, finding another mercenary leader, Beluzo Ferguson, there as well. Ferguson's eyes showed surprise when he saw him, followed by a hint of panic, which he quickly concealed, but Doug still caught it. HMPH, Ferguson's already large nostrils flared even wider as he snorted heavily. He seemed suddenly filled with fighting spirit. Lord Irwin. We, Rhino, are enough. There's absolutely no need for the weaklings of Blackhound, Rhino. Blackhound. What nostalgic words, Doug thought, a tremor running through him. These two words referred to Ferguson's mercenary group and his own. But since being sent to the labor camp, these words had been buried deep in his memory. Now, they surfaced again, awakening the habits Doug had developed as a mercenary leader. Rhino scum. Who are you calling a weakling? Doug retorted without hesitation. Though his words were harsh, a surge of joy welled up inside him. Judging from Ferguson's flustered reaction upon seeing him, and his words to the soldier named Irwin, the Aldo people seemed to need them somewhere, and not for low-level work like shoveling coal. Otherwise, Ferguson wouldn't have been so anxious. He had acted as if some business was about to be stolen. Could it be a glimmer of hope for escape? Chapter 498 Mercenaries 4. The officer whom Ferguson addressed as Lord Irwin raised a hand, silencing the former Rhino mercenary leader who was about to continue his verbal sparring with Doug. Irwin addressed Doug. You may call me Major Jeremy Irwin. I currently serve in the General Staff of the Arda Army. Doug straightened up and nodded emphatically to the major before him. Lord Irwin. He knew that the Arda Army didn't use the elaborate etiquette often reserved for noble officers elsewhere. He then began to carefully observe the officer before him. He had short, dark chestnut hair, thick, bushy eyebrows, and shallow-set, bright eyes. Doug had always seen Arda soldiers with very spirited eyes. He wasn't very tall, but his build was quite stocky. I'll explain why I called you here, Irwin said. Just now, I only briefly mentioned it to Commander Ferguson, without going into details, so please listen carefully to what I have to say. Commander Ferguson, who had been arrogant towards Doug, immediately became like a well-behaved schoolboy. Irwin paced slowly in the office, introducing the situation unhurriedly. A month ago, a war broke out in Horn Bay. The two sides were the coastal countries led by the Horn Bay Alliance and the inland countries led by the Horn Bay Church. Oh ho, they finally started fighting. Ferguson couldn't help but ask with schadenfreude. Doug, on the other hand, cursed inwardly. Why didn't you start sooner? With his keen sense of war, he had sensed years ago that some conflict was bound to erupt under such pressure, something the mercenaries would naturally welcome. It was just that the conflict had been delayed, which was why they took on the business in the Northwest Bay, only to have it backfire here. If you'd started fighting a few years earlier, I, Uncle Doug, would still be enjoying myself on the battlefields and red light districts of Horn Bay. Why would I be spending my days shoveling coal in some place I'd never even heard of before? Before I could continue, Irwin suddenly stopped, looking at the two men and asking, I need to understand, if you were still mercenaries in Horn Bay, which side would you be hired by? The Horn Bay Alliance representing freedom and its allies, or the Church representing faith and its vassal states? Sir, Ferguson grinned, answering first, freedom, faith, can those things put food on the table? Of course, we'll fight for whoever pays the highest price. Ferguson's answer made Doug wary. It seemed that years in prison hadn't changed this seemingly reckless but actually shrewd fellow. In Doug's judgment, this Lord Irwin was testing them, especially their attitude towards religion. Doug quickly replied, we are mercenaries, sir. Money is our only pursuit, profit is our highest guide. However, he blinked a few times, not finishing his sentence. All right, I understand, Irwin continued pacing in front of the two men. You should know that the Northwest Bay now has a very developed maritime trade, and Horn Bay is an extremely important node on the maritime trade route. Our government and merchants have invested a lot there, goods, shops, money, and so on, but now, he suddenly raised his voice, the sudden war threatens these properties. Although we have absolute confidence in the moral standards of the people of Horn Bay, even in the most honest and simple places, there are bound to be bad apples and opportunists. Not to mention we must consider the worst-case scenario, that these riches will be plundered by the rebel armies on both sides. Our lord, the far-sighted Lord Paul Gleman, believes that there should be a force of considerable deterrence in Horn Bay to protect our legitimate property from the covetousness and harm of those outlaws. So, Irwin's eyes lingered on Doug for a moment, then turned to Ferguson. "The General Staff has ordered me to find suitable candidates to establish such a force in Horn Bay." Before Irwin's words had even finished, Doug and Ferguson blurted out, "My lord, I am willing to serve Lord Gleman. My lord, I am even more willing to serve Lord Gleman than his." They glared at each other, now clearly seeing each other as rivals. Irwin's words had made Doug and Ferguson understand why they had been summoned. The Aldo were sending them, or some of them, back to Horn Bay to protect the property. It made sense. The Northwest Bay was thousands of miles from Horn Bay, and it would be inconvenient for Alda, a local Aldo power, to send troops there. Who could be more suitable than the Horn Bay local bullies currently imprisoned in their own jail? What did this mean? Freedom. Once chosen, they could return to their familiar homeland, to their familiar battlefield. Wasn't that like birds returning to the sky, fish returning to the sea? Don't get too excited yet. Seeing the two vying to express their loyalty, Irwin laughed unabashedly. "The condition for your return to Horn Bay is that you must pledge allegiance to Lord Gleman." The two men immediately answered in unison. "I'm willing to pledge allegiance to Lord Gleman. I'm more willing to pledge allegiance to Lord Gleman than he is. My loyalty comes without any conditions. I don't want any territory or knighthood. I guarantee I'll be more loyal than this daydreaming, talking nonsense guy next to me." The two mercenary leaders expressed their loyalty to Earl Gleman as if they were placing a bet. "Gentlemen," Irwin stopped them. "Loyalty uttered in words is unreliable, empty vows bind nothing," the two said in unison. "We'll sign a contract. Horn Bay is too far from us, a contract won't guarantee anything." "Doug, then, Lord Irwin, what do you mean?" Irwin grinned, a hint of malice in his eyes, and said, "Use your Horn Bay methods." "Our Horn Bay methods?" The two hesitated, then realized, You mean, give us. Irwin's smile vanished, replaced by a serious tone. "Yes, brand your bodies with the Earl's mark. Only then can your loyalty be guaranteed." Silence fell over the room. Lord Irwin, can't we discuss this further?" "HMPH, Irwin retorted sarcastically, "aren't you already Lord Griles's de facto slaves?" These words struck them like a dagger. They were heartbroken. Chapter 499 Mercenaries 5. Yes, they were now, in effect, Count Paul Gleman's slaves. And they themselves had long accepted this status. Apart from lacking a brand, what difference was there between them and slaves? "Our Count is a kind and benevolent lord," Major Irwin said. "He believes your free will should be fully respected, so he's given you two paths to choose from. The first path is to obediently accept his mark and return to Horn Bay to resume your mercenary status, of course, as mercenaries of the Gleman family. Provided you complete your assigned combat missions, you can live like normal people, just like before you came to Northwest Bay, but you must be available at a moment's notice. The other path is to continue working here and wait for Lord Gleman to be in a good mood. Perhaps he can pardon your crimes. Consider carefully which path you choose." Major Irwin maintained his previous smile, leisurely strolling to a reclining chair and sipping the tea prepared for him by the labor camp officials, awaiting the two prisoners' reply. The autumn sunlight was warm and tranquil, streaming through the windows on the south wall into the office, casting dappled patterns of light and shadow on the floor. Bello Doug stretched his stiff neck and looked out the window, following the sunlight. Because his office was on the second floor in its location, the mercenary leader was fortunate to observe the camp from a perspective different from usual. He saw the labor camp walls, topped with sharp wooden spikes to prevent prisoners from escaping, and watchtowers standing at the corners. At the southernmost part of the camp, a large, dark hole was clearly visible, the entrance to the coal mine. Coal was hauled out daily, and he spent his days working with these black stones. The area was stained black by coal dust. In the nearby open space, rows of prisoners stood quietly, his mercenary comrades. They didn't know what was happening, they didn't know what choice their leader faced, and that their fates would be changed by that choice. Perhaps Ferguson's men were standing in another open space, out of his sight. His gaze swept out of the labor camp. Green forests, golden wheat fields, winding country lanes, and wisps of smoke rising from distant houses came into view. A few years ago, these scenes would have been utterly ordinary, but now Doug suddenly found them incredibly beautiful. If only he had a paintbrush. Wait, when did he develop such an artist's sensibility? Doug opened his mouth. Lord Irwin, may I answer you tomorrow?" Ferguson interrupted him. "I don't want to make a decision right away either," Doug said. Irwin stared at them for a full half-minute. "All right, I'll give you time to consider. I'll be waiting in this room until sunset tomorrow." You can come find me anytime you've decided. Oh, and don't forget to tell your companions about the 2 options I mentioned. I think everyone has the right to choose freely. Ferguson and Doug left the office one after the other. In the corridor, Doug feigned confusion and asked, Ferguson, why don't you immediately agree to Aldo's demands? It's just a mere brand. You can return to Horn Bay, which you've been longing for day and night. HMPH, Ferguson replied disdainfully, I'm just playing along with that Aldo guy. Who do you think I am? I'm a proud warrior. I'm a free-spirited bird. How can I accept the humiliating brand of slavery for a little superficial freedom? If I go back to Horn Bay with that monstrous thing, what will people I know think of me? As the leader of the Rhino mercenary group, I'll never be able to hold my head up high again. He turned to look at Doug. Black Dog, why don't you agree? You shouldn't care about these things, Doug replied angrily. Don't look down on me, you brute. My ancestors were nobles, my blood is far more noble than yours. Even if I'm physically imprisoned, I will never yield in spirit. If it weren't for the fact that fighting was forbidden in the camp and the punishment for it was severe, he would have risked his life to punch a few holes in the head of the bastard next to him. Having said that, he ignored Ferguson, quickened his pace, and walked past. Behind him came the voice of that annoying guy. Still got some backbone of a Horn Bay man. Doug returned to the clearing and saw his companions still standing there. He explained the situation to the guards supervising nearby, and then told everyone about the 2 choices Major Irwin had given them. A roar erupted in the clearing. I want to go back to Horn Bay. I want to go back to Horn Bay. Yeah, I've had enough of this place, but, are we going to become slaves? Don't be ridiculous. Aren't you a slave now? Do you want to be a slave confined and forced to work every day, or a slave who can roam freely? The sounds of discussion and arguing filled the area. Doug quietly estimated that the vast majority wanted to go back to Horn Bay. While everyone was talking, he slipped behind a building and, using the building's cover, circled back to the camp administration building. The moment he stepped inside, Doug abandoned all his previous hesitation. He decided he would return to Horn Bay, even with the added mark of shame on his body. Actually, when Irwin gave him the choice, he almost blurted out that he was going back to Horn Bay, but the damned Ferguson had interfered, making him hesitate again. Now Doug had made up his mind. To hell with face, he was going back. His whole body and mind suddenly relaxed, even his steps became lighter, and before he knew it, he was in front of Major Irwin's office. Doug stretched out his right hand, gripped the doorknob, and silently recited, Forest, wheat field, smoke, I'm coming. I should knock first. After 3 knocks, a heavenly voice came from inside, come in. He gripped the doorknob again, pushed open the door with a little force. Ferguson, an unexpected person, appeared in his field of vision. Ferguson saw him too. The Rhino mercenary group leader's broad face began to change color rapidly, turning red, redder, and redder still, until it looked like a boiled crab shell. Doug, you with your thick eyebrows and big eyes. Chapter 500 Mercenaries 6. Ferguson screamed in agony. The red-hot branding iron was pressed against his tight flesh. Grayish-white smoke billowed from between the iron and the flesh, accompanied by a sizzling sound that sent chills down one's spine. The smell of burnt meat began to fill the air. Doug, standing not far away, couldn't help but cover his nose. The prison guard responsible for branding, feeling that it was about time, gripped the handle and removed the branding iron. The moment the branding iron separated from the flesh, Ferguson let out a heavy groan. He squeezed his eyes shut, grimaced, his cheeks bulged, and large beads of sweat streamed down his forehead, down his cheeks, and dripped from his chin to the ground. A dark red mark appeared on Ferguson's muscular arm, surrounded by reddish skin. The mark consisted of 2 parts, a vivid dragon head pattern on top and the initials of the surname Gleman in the Corner Bay language below. Another person in a white coat scooped a spoonful of sticky substance from an earthenware pot with a metal spoon and applied it to Ferguson's arm. Ferguson immediately felt a cool, tingling sensation spread across his previously burning arm. It must be some kind of burn ointment. However, this didn't completely eliminate the pain. It still hurt. Gulp. Doug, who had watched the whole thing, swallowed hard, feeling weak all over. He was next. When he made a living as a mercenary in Corner Bay, he had tortured his enemies, including the well-known method of branding with hot irons, but he had never imagined it would be used on himself. The guard reheated the branding iron in the red-hot furnace, then beckoned to him. Come on, Doug, you can't escape this, Doug cursed inwardly. He had suggested a tattoo instead, but Erwin had rejected it without a word. He walked over resignedly, his steps heavy. Doug pulled out a wooden stick, intending to bite down hard on it to resist the pain. He didn't want to scream like Ferguson, losing all his composure. The guard asked expressionlessly, where to brand. Major Erwin allowed them to choose the location, but it had to be easily visible. Ferguson chose his arm, which could usually be covered by clothing. He could simply roll up his sleeve when needed. Me too, on my arm. Doug pointed to the outside of his right upper arm with his left hand, then bit down hard on the prepared stick, his teeth digging deep into the wood. The guard gripped the handle and took the reheated branding iron out of the furnace. The branding iron was glowing red hot, and in Doug's eyes, it seemed to radiate the intense heat of the sun. Getting close to the sun would burn him. It would hurt terribly. It would hurt so much. His brain inexplicably recalled several past burns, causing Doug to break out in a cold sweat even before he touched the iron. The prison guard held the iron, gesturing towards Doug's shoulder, and Doug's body involuntarily flinched a few times. "Haha. Coward of the Black Dogs," Ferguson, standing nearby, timely mocked, gloating with a you-get-a-taste expression. Doug pressed his lips together again, feeling like his teeth were about to fall out. He gave the guard a look that said, "You can begin," and then closed his eyes. The guard's hand moved forward, quickly, accurately, and ruthlessly, bringing the branding iron into intimate contact with the skin on the outside of Doug's upper arm. The sizzling sound rang out again, and the same burning smell appeared in the air once more. Doug's eyes widened instantly, his eyeballs seemingly about to pop out of their sockets, the veins in the whites of his eyes clearly visible. A few seconds later, the guard withdrew the branding iron. As it was removed, Doug felt his skin was stuck to the iron, the burning pain immediately mixed with a tearing agony. He bent over slightly, the wooden stick in his mouth clattering to the ground, copious amounts of saliva dribbling from his mouth, mixing with sweat and falling to the ground. Ha, 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 he gasped for breath, as if this would make him feel a little better. The white-coated guard beside him applied ointment. "All right, you guys go back to your dorms and rest." The guard, putting the branding iron back into the furnace to heat it, turned to them, gesturing for them to leave quickly. "There are still a lot of people behind." The two looked out of the building. It was a long line of people from the Black Dog and Rhino mercenary groups, preparing to receive the brand that would grant them a degree of freedom. All the mercenaries made the same choice as their leader. Lord Gleman, in the Lord's office, Chief of Staff Schroeder handed Paul a thick stack of documents. "The mercenaries have been selected. Please take a look." Paul took the documents and casually flipped through a few pages. "So, all the mercenary prisoners will be sent back to Horn Bay." Schroeder, "Yes." Major Erwin tested them. They were able to stand in the sun for an hour and maintain formation without resting or fainting. Their physical fitness met the standards, exceeding our expectations. This will significantly shorten their training time, allowing for faster deployment to Horn Bay for combat missions. Of course, this is thanks to the militarized management and relatively good food in our labor camp. "Good," Paul nodded. "The more the better, of course. As originally planned, give them a batch of armor and weapons, along with some money, and then the rest is up to them." "Huh?" He noticed something interesting. "Ferguson?" "Haha, Ferguson, Fergus, Fergus. Schroeder, do you remember I had a knight also named Fergus?" "I remember," Schroeder confirmed. "The pronunciation of that name is very common, whether in Horn Bay or Aldo." He immediately steered the conversation back to the main topic. "Sir, I think we should send a group of our own men with him. We can't let these mercenaries act entirely on their own. They should follow instructions from the Northwest Bay." "Oh, of course," Paul readily agreed. "That's natural. I've already had the Ministry of Education select a group of excellent instructors to accompany them back to Horn Bay. The point is to keep an eye on them, manage them, ensure they obey orders, and absolutely prevent them from committing atrocities like robbery or insulting women. Otherwise, they will tarnish our honor. In that case," Schroeder further suggested, "why not also select a group of officers and cadets from the military academy to go, so they can experience real warfare firsthand, observe how armies outside of Arda fight, summarize their experiences and patterns, compile them into a book, enrich our database, and provide valuable material for our army." "Ha! I was just thinking of the two," Paul said excitedly. "In both scale and quality, the war at Horn Bay far surpassed the war of the usurpers of previous years. This war was an invaluable subject of observation, allowing the Arda army to understand all aspects of the military in this era. He ordered, "Schroeder, go and arrange this as soon as possible, please vote." End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.